I served 12 years in the shadows of governments that denied my existence. I dismantled regimes and silenced warlords without leaving a fingerprint. But when I came home to the $10 million mansion I had bought to keep my mother safe, I found her wearing a maid uniform, trembling as she served champagne to the people who had stolen my life. They looked at my mother and saw a servant. They looked at me and saw a homeless old man. They have no idea that the ghost they are mocking is the one who is about to dig their graves. Before I unleash hell, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders is a crime that deserves the ultimate punishment. My name is Lucius King. Most people think I died in a boating accident off the coast of Panama 5 years ago. That was the cover story my handlers gave my family when I went deep undercover for a final off-the-books operation. I am 73 years old, but the limp I carried as I stepped out of the taxi at JFK Airport was only half real. My left knee clicks when it rains a souvenir from a fall in Kabul, but I exaggerated the stoop in my shoulders. I needed to look like exactly what I was on paper, a broken, forgotten old man with nothing but a duffel bag and a faded army jacket. The taxi driver, a young kid with headphones around his neck, had looked at me in the rearview mirror with skepticism when I gave him the address in the Hamptons. He asked me 3 times if I was sure. People who look like me wearing boots that have seen more mud than pavement do not usually go to that part of Long Island unless they are there to cut the grass or clean the pool. I just handed him a wad of crumpled cash I had exchanged at the border. I did not tell him that I bought the land he was driving toward before the developers even knew it existed. I did not tell him that the house sitting on that cliff was designed by me, paid for with blood money earned in places God forgot specifically, so my mother Odessa would never have to lift a finger again for the rest of her life. I had wired the money to my daughter Tiana and her husband Brad 12 years ago. The instructions were simple: build the house, move Mama in, hire the best nurses, keep her happy. I stayed away to keep them safe from my enemies. Now that I was retired, officially a ghost, I was coming home to surprise them. I imagined Mama sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket looking at the ocean. I imagined Tiana running out to hug me. But as the taxi rounded the final bend of the private driveway, the fantasy evaporated like mist. The iron gates I had paid for were closed. A security booth, which was not in the original blueprint, stood guard like a checkpoint. Loud thumping bass music vibrated through the closed windows of the cab. The driveway was lined with cars that cost more than most people earn in a decade. Porsches, Bentleys, a bright yellow Lamborghini. The taxi driver hesitated. He said he could not go further without a pass. I told him to let me out right there. I grabbed my duffel bag and stepped onto the gravel. The wind was cold, carrying the salt spray from the Atlantic, but it also carried the smell of expensive cigars and roasting meat. I walked up to the pedestrian gate. A security guard, a man half my size with a uniform that was too tight, stepped out. He looked me up and down with a sneer that I had seen on 1,000 faces before. He saw a black man in dirty clothes and assumed I was lost or begging. He did not ask for my name, he just pointed a thumb back toward the main road. He told me the delivery entrance was 2 miles back and that the kitchen was not taking handouts today. I did not argue. I did not tell him that the ground he was standing on belonged to me. In my line of work, you do not storm the front door when you can slide through the cracks. I apologized, pitching my voice to sound raspy and weak. I told him I was looking for Odessa King. I said I was an old friend from the church. The guard laughed. He said there was no Odessa King listed as an owner here. He said the estate belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, Brad and Tiana. My stomach tightened. The house was supposed to be in Mama's name. That was the deal. The guard stepped closer, his hand resting on his taser. He told me to turn around and start walking before he called the cops to haul me away for trespassing. I shuffled away, dragging my left leg. I waited until I was around the bend, out of his line of sight. Then the limp vanished. I moved into the dense line of hedges that bordered the estate. I knew these hedges. I knew the perimeter fence behind them because I was the one who insisted on the reinforced steel mesh. But I also knew the flaw. 12 years ago, I had instructed the contractors to leave a service hatch behind the generator unit on the north side, just big enough for a man to squeeze through in an emergency. It was meant to be an escape route for my family. Today, it was my way in. I moved through the underbrush with the silence of a predator. The years fell away. My breathing slowed. My senses sharpened. I found the hatch concealed under overgrown ivy. It was rusted, but it opened. I slipped through and found myself in the shadow of the massive generator, the hum of the machine masking my movements. I was inside the compound. The backyard was a spectacle of excess. The infinity pool I had designed for my mother's hydrotherapy was filled with floating inflatable swans. Dozens of people were mingling, holding crystal flutes, laughing with their heads thrown back. They were young, beautiful, and completely oblivious. Waiters in white tuxedos woven through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres. I stayed in the shadows of the landscaped garden, crouching behind a row of ornamental topiaries. I scanned the faces. I was looking for Tiana. I wanted to see my little girl. I wanted to see the woman she had become, but I did not see her. Instead, I saw him, Brad Sterling, my son-in-law. He was standing near the poolside bar wearing a white linen suit that probably cost $5,000. He was holding a glass of whiskey, gesturing wildly as he spoke to a group of men who looked like bankers. He looked heavier than the last photo I had seen, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogance. He was laughing, a loud barking sound that grated on my nerves. I watched him slap one of the men on the back, playing the role of the generous host, the king of the castle. And then I saw her. At first, I didn't recognize the woman standing near the patio doors. She was tiny, shrunken by age and gravity. She was wearing a black dress with a white apron, the kind of uniform you see in movies about the 1950s. It was ill-fitting, hanging loosely off her frail shoulders. She was holding a heavy silver tray loaded with empty glasses. Her hands were shaking. The tray rattled a soft metallic trembling that no one else seemed to notice. I squinted. The woman turned her head slightly to avoid a guest who bumped into her without apologizing. The profile was unmistakable. The high cheekbones. The silver hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. The eyes that had watched me grow up, that had cried when I went to war, that had prayed for me every night for 40 years. It was Mama. My heart hammered against my ribs like a sledgehammer. My vision narrowed. The world turned red at the edges. This was the woman I had built this fortress for. This was the woman who was supposed to be the queen of this estate. And she was standing there, dressed like a servant, invisible to the people, partying in her home. I watched as she struggled to keep the tray steady. A young woman in a sequined dress bumped into her again, harder this time. A glass tipped over and shattered on the slate patio. The sound cut through the music. The conversation near the bar stopped. Brad Sterling turned around. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance. He didn't rush over to see if the old woman was hurt. He didn't apologize to his guests for the accident. He marched over to her, his expensive shoes crunching on the broken glass. I was close enough to hear him. I was close enough to snap his neck before his body hit the floor. But I froze. I needed to see this. I needed to know the depth of the rot. Brad loomed over her. He was a foot taller than my mother. He pointed a finger in her face. He didn't call her Mom. He didn't call her Mrs. King. "Jesus Christ, Nana," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "How hard is it to hold a tray? You're embarrassing me." Mama looked down at her feet. She looked terrified. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brad," she whispered. Her voice was thin, cracked. "My hands. The arthritis." "I don't care about your hands." Brad snapped loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. He grabbed the tray from her, shoving it onto a nearby table with a clatter. "I told you if you want to stay in this house, you have to earn your keep. We don't run a charity here. Clean this up, now, before I decide to put you back in the basement room with no window." The basement. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I had designed the basement as a wine cellar and storage. It was cold, damp, unfinished. Mama fell to her knees. She began picking up the shards of glass with her bare, trembling hands. A jagged piece sliced her thumb. A drop of bright red blood fell onto the white patio stone. She didn't flinch. She just kept cleaning, wiping the blood away with her apron. Brad turned back to his guests, his smile switching back on like a light bulb. "Sorry about that, everyone," he announced, his voice booming with fake charm. "Good help is so hard to find these days, especially when you inherit them." The guests laughed. They actually laughed. I stood in the shadows, my fingernails digging into my palms so hard that I felt the skin break. The pain grounded me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to charge, to tear through that hedge vault, the fence, and beat him until he couldn't remember his own name. I had killed men for less. I had toppled governments for less. But 12 years in Black Ops had taught me one thing above all else. Anger is a weapon, but only if you control it. If you let it control you, it's a suicide vest. If I attacked him now, I would be arrested. I was legally dead. I had no ID, no access to my accounts yet, no legal standing. I would be just a crazy old man attacking a wealthy homeowner. Brad would spin the story. He would say I was dangerous. He would use it to hurt Mama even more. No. Death was too easy for Brad Sterling. A bullet is a mercy he did not deserve. I didn't want him dead. I wanted him dismantled. I wanted him to lose his money, his status, his freedom, and his pride. I wanted him to feel the same fear my mother was feeling right now. I watched Mama struggle to her feet, clutching the broken glass in her apron. She limped toward the service door, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen her. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I released my fists. I wiped the blood from my palms onto my jeans. I stepped back deeper into the foliage. I had seen enough to know the war had started, but I was missing one piece of intelligence. Where was Tiana? Was she part of this? Did she know her husband was treating her grandmother like a slave? Or was she a victim too? I couldn't move against Brad until I knew where my daughter stood. If she was complicit, God help me, she would fall with him. If she was a prisoner, I would burn the world down to free her. I adjusted the collar of my ragged jacket. I wasn't Lucius King, the wealthy owner tonight. I wasn't the father coming home. Tonight I was just a ghost. And ghosts are very good at haunting houses without being seen. I circled around the back of the property toward the kitchen entrance where Mama had disappeared. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the lawn. The party was getting louder, the lights in the pool turning the water a neon blue. I slipped into the darkness. The hunt was on. Here is the detailed script for Part 2, written in English as requested, optimized for AI voice reading with a natural flow and emotional depth. I stood in the shadow of the doorway watching the woman who used to be my little girl. Tiana was sitting at the massive marble island in the center of a kitchen that cost more than my first house. It was 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, but she was pouring herself a glass of amber liquid that definitely wasn't apple juice. Her hands were shaking. I watched the crystal decanter rattle against the rim of the glass. The sound echoed in the empty, sterile room like a cry for help. She looked terrible. The vibrant, glowing girl I remembered had been replaced by a ghost. Her skin was pale and her eyes were surrounded by dark, bruised circles that makeup couldn't hide. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week, or perhaps she was terrified of what she saw when she closed her eyes. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a physical ache that had nothing to do with my old joints and everything to do with a father's broken heart. I wanted to run to her and knock that glass out of her hand and wrap her in a blanket, but I froze. I caught my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator. I barely recognized myself, so I knew she wouldn't either. My beard was thick and gray, untrimmed for months. My skin was weathered from working outdoors, and I had lost 30 pounds. I looked like a drifter. I looked like nobody. That was exactly what I needed to be. Tiana looked up and spotted me. She didn't jump. She didn't scream. She just looked at me with dull, lifeless eyes, as if seeing a stranger in her kitchen was the least of her problems. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was raspy. I bowed my head slightly, adopting the posture of a man who is used to being invisible. "The agency sent me, ma'am. I'm the new maintenance man, the gardener." She blinked slowly, trying to process the information through the fog of alcohol. "Oh, right. The other one. Brad fired him yesterday. Something about the roses." She waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that looked too heavy for her thin wrist. "Just don't make any noise." "My husband. Brad. He has a headache. Everyone has a headache in this house." She turned back to her drink, and I felt a wave of relief mixed with sorrow. She didn't know me. My own daughter looked right at me and saw nothing but a servant. I walked past her, moving deeper into the house. It was a cold place. Everything was white or gray or chrome. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom or a clinic. There were no photos on the walls, no clutter, no signs of life. I needed to find Odessa, my wife, the woman who had stuck by me through bankruptcy and illness, the woman who deserved to be sitting on a throne, not hidden away in this mausoleum. I found her in the laundry room. I stood in the doorway and my knees almost gave out. They hadn't given her a room. They had put a folding cot in the narrow space between the washing machine and the wall. It was a windowless box that smelled of bleach and damp lint. My Odessa. The woman who loved fresh air and sunlight was curled up on that cot under a thin gray blanket. She looked so small, frail. I stepped inside, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Odessa," I whispered. She stirred and opened her eyes. They were cloudy. The dementia had been stealing her away from me by inches for the last 2 years, but seeing the vacancy in her stare now broke me all over again. She looked at me, and a small, confused smile touched her lips. "Lucius," she whispered, "you're late for supper." I knelt beside her, grasping her cold hand. "I'm here, Odessa. I'm here." She patted my rough cheek. "Lucius is coming back. He didn't die. They said he died, but he didn't. He's just working late. He's always working." She didn't see me. She saw a memory of me. To her, I was just a comforting presence, a hallucination brought on by loneliness. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I need you to eat something, Odessa," I said softly. She shook her head. "Not allowed. Brad said no eating in the laundry room. Crumbs bring ants. No ants allowed. Rage. It started in my stomach and spread to my fingertips, hot and electric. I looked around the tiny room. On the side of the dryer, there was a magnetic whiteboard. Written in jagged, angry red marker were instructions. Rules for Nana. Number 1, no wandering during party hours. Number 2, no eye contact with guests. Number 3, toilet flushing limited to nighttime. I stared at those words. No eye contact with guests. As if she were a dog. As if she were a shameful secret to be hidden away. This wasn't just neglect. This was cruelty. This was a systematic stripping away of her dignity. Brad. This had Brad's fingerprints all over it. Tiana might be lost in her addiction, but Brad was the architect of this prison. I heard heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway. The sound of expensive leather shoes striking the hardwood floor with arrogant purpose. I stood up quickly and moved away from Odessa, pretending to inspect the washing machine. A man filled the doorway. Brad. He was younger than I expected, but he carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who has never been told no. He was wearing a suit that cost more than I used to make in a year. He was holding a phone to his ear, but when he saw me, he lowered it. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. I kept my head down. "New hire, sir. From the agency. For the garden and the repairs." Brad looked me up and down, his lip curling in disgust. "You look like a hobo. Did they pick you up off the street? I pay that agency a premium for top-tier staff, and they send me Santa Claus on meth." I didn't answer. I just gripped the wrench in my pocket, my knuckles turning white. "Get out," he spat. "I'm calling them right now. You're fired. Get off my property before I call the cops." He turned his back on me, dialing a number on his phone. I was about to lose my access. I was about to lose the only chance I had to save them. I needed a miracle. Suddenly, a loud, grinding noise echoed from the backyard. It sounded like metal chewing on metal, followed by a high-pitched whine. Brad froze. "What is that? What did you break?" "It's the pool pump, sir," I said quietly. My voice was steady. "It sounds like the bearings are seized. If it runs like that for another 5 minutes, the motor will burn out. That's a $10,000 replacement." Brad looked panicked. He rushed to the back door, looking out at the massive infinity pool. "Well, don't just stand there, make it stop." I walked past him. I moved with a speed that belied my age. I went out to the pump house. I knew this model. I knew machines. Machines were honest. They didn't lie. They didn't cheat. They didn't treat their mothers like animals. If you treated a machine with respect, it worked. I grabbed a specialized tool from my belt. I bypassed the safety switch and adjusted the tension on the impeller. It was a temporary fix, a trick I learned 30 years ago working on industrial turbines. In 30 seconds, the grinding stopped. The whine faded into a gentle hum. The water began to circulate smoothly again. I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and turned around. Brad was watching me. The panic in his eyes had been replaced by calculation. He was doing the math. "I saved the motor," I said. "It will hold, but you need a new bearing eventually." Brad hung up his phone. He looked at the pump, then back at me. The other guy said we needed a whole new system. He quoted me 15 grand. He was lying, I said. Or he was stupid. "You just need a $50 part and someone who knows how to install it." Brad smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who just found a wounded animal he could use. "You know how to fix the HVAC too. The AC is making a noise." I nodded. "I can fix anything, sir." Brad laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Well, aren't you a hidden treasure? Fine. You can stay. But don't think you're getting full rate. Since you look like a bum, I'm paying you off the books. Cash. Half the agency rate. Take it or leave it. I looked at this man, this boy, who was tormenting my family, who was stealing my money and treating my wife like a prisoner. He thought he was winning. He thought he was getting a deal. He didn't know he was inviting the judge, jury, and executioner into his home. I'll take it, sir, I said. Good, Brad said, turning to walk away. And shave that beard. You look ridiculous. Oh, and old boy. I looked up. Stay out of the main house unless called. You sleep in the shed. He walked away, leaving me standing by the humming pool pump. I looked up at the second-floor window where I could see Tiana's silhouette, glass in hand. I looked at the small vent that led to the laundry room where Odessa was sleeping. Old boy. He called me old boy. I reached into my pocket and touched the small voice recorder I had been running the entire time. I had recorded the threats. I had recorded the illegal employment offer. I had recorded the condition of the house. I wasn't just the gardener. I was the gathering storm. I went to the shed. It was full of rusty tools and cobwebs. It was perfect. I sat on an overturned bucket and pulled out a small notebook. I wrote down the date and the time. Then I wrote one sentence. Entry secured. The evaluation begins. I wasn't here to argue. I wasn't here to beg. I was here to balance the ledger. And looking at the way Brad walked, looking at the way Tiana drank, looking at the rules on that whiteboard, I knew one thing for certain. The debt was heavy, and collection day was coming. Darkness has always been an old friend of mine. When you spend half your life working in places that don't exist on any map, you learn to love the shadows. It was 2 a.m. The estate was silent save for the rhythmic hum of the pool pump I had fixed earlier that day. To anyone watching, I was just the old man sleeping in the garden shed. But I wasn't sleeping. I was preparing for war. I slipped out of the shed dressed in black. I didn't need a balaclava or tactical gear. I just needed my hands and the skills that had been dormant for too long. The back door of the main house had a smart lock. Expensive, fancy, and completely vulnerable if you knew that this specific model had a magnetic bypass flaw. I didn't even have to touch the keypad. A strong magnet placed at the right angle and the solenoid clicked open with a soft surrender. I was inside. The house felt different at night. Without the pretentious dinner parties and the clinking of wine glasses, it felt hollow. It felt like what it was, a crime scene. My feet made no sound on the polished marble floors as I moved toward the west wing where Brad had his home office. The door was locked, but a simple tension wrench and a rake pick made short work of it. 3 seconds. That was all the security Brad thought his secrets needed. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, not daring to turn on the main light. I used a small tactical flashlight, shielding the beam with my fingers, so only a sliver of light cut through the gloom. The office was a shrine to Brad's ego. There were framed photos of him shaking hands with minor celebrities, awards for sales targets that probably didn't exist, and behind his massive oak desk was a wall safe. I approached it. It was a digital model. Most people would try to drill it or hack the electronics. I just looked at the keypad. The numbers 2, 4, and 8 were slightly more worn than the others. Grease from fingertips leaves a story if you know how to read it. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried Tiana's birthday. Nothing. Then I tried the date they bought this house. Beep. Click. The heavy steel door swung open. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. Inside were stacks of cash rubber banded together, passports, and a thick leather folder. I bypassed the cash. Money was just paper. I wanted the truth. I pulled out the leather folder and opened it on the desk. The first document that slid out made my blood run cold. It was a death certificate. Name: Lucius King. Date of death: October 14th, 5 years ago. Cause of death: accidental drowning. Boating accident off the coast of Baja. Body status: not recovered. I stared at the paper and my hand shook, not from fear but from a rage so pure it felt like white heat. They had killed me. While I was lying in a hospital bed in a foreign country fighting a fever that almost took my brain, they had decided I was better off dead. They didn't just abandon me, they erased me. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was Tiana's, my daughter, the girl I had taught to ride a bike. The girl I had carried on my shoulders. She had signed a legal document swearing that I was dead so she could access the trust fund. So that was how they did it. That was how they got the house. The trust was set up to release funds only upon my death or my 85th birthday. They couldn't wait. They wanted the money now. They turned a missing person case into a funeral without a body. I flipped the page. There was more. Behind the death certificate was a loan agreement. But this wasn't from a bank. There was no logo of a reputable financial institution. The header just said, Janus Holdings. I knew that name. I knew it from files I had read a lifetime ago. Janus Holdings was a front for an organized crime syndicate operating out of the darker corners of the city. They didn't give loans based on credit scores. They gave loans based on blood. I scanned the numbers and my stomach dropped. Principal amount, $5 million. Interest rate, 20% monthly, collateral. The King Estate. Brad wasn't just a spoiled brat. He was a gambler and a fool. He had borrowed $5 million from sharks and he had put my house, Odessa's house, on the line. I did the math quickly in my head. Based on the dates, he was already 3 months behind on payments. That explained the lack of staff. That explained the cheap repairs. He was drowning. And when the water finally went over his head, he wasn't going to be the only one who suffered. These people didn't foreclose with lawyers. They foreclosed with fire and baseball bats. They would throw Odessa out on the street or worse. I took out my phone and snapped high-resolution photos of every document, the death certificate, the loan agreement, the forged signatures. I had the evidence of fraud. I had the evidence of their desperation. But I wasn't done. Information is good, but intelligence is better. I needed to know what Brad was planning. I needed to hear the panic in his voice when he thought he was alone. I reached into the deep pocket of my work trousers. I didn't just carry wrenches. I pulled out a small black case. Inside were 3 listening devices. These weren't the cheap bugs you buy at a spy shop. These were military-grade piezoelectric microphones, the size of a grain of rice. Battery life of 6 months, impossible to detect with standard sweepers. I moved to the landline phone on the desk. Brad was old-fashioned in his affectations. He liked making deals on a corded phone. It made him feel powerful. I unscrewed the mouthpiece. It took 10 seconds to solder the bug into the existing circuitry. Now every call he made, every threat he received would be recorded directly to my server. But the office wasn't enough. A man like Brad does his dirtiest business when he thinks he's moving. I packed up the safe exactly as I found it. I wiped the keypad with a microfiber cloth to remove my fresh prints. I locked the office door behind me and moved toward the garage. The garage was a cavernous space smelling of rubber and premium wax. In the center sat a silver sports car, German engineering, fast, loud. It was Brad's pride and joy. I slid underneath the chassis. It was low to the ground, but I was thin now. The hunger of the last few years had stripped away the fat, leaving only sinew and bone. I located the rear wheel well. There was a hollow space inside the frame rail. Perfect. I attached the second device. This one was a GPS tracker combined with an audio transmitter. It would tell me where he went, who he met, and what he said. If he drove to meet his loan shark, I would know. If he went to sell my wife's jewelry, I would know. I slid out from under the car and dusted myself off. I stood in the silence of the garage looking at this machine that cost more than most people earn in a decade. Brad thought this car made him a man. He thought the suit made him a king. He was about to learn that a king isn't defined by what he owns, but by what he protects. I made my way back to the garden shed. The night air was cool against my skin. I slipped inside my humble quarters and sat on the cot. I put on my headphones and typed a command into my laptop. The screen flickered to life. 2 green dots appeared on the map. Audio streams active. I could hear the silence of the office. I could hear the settling of the car engine in the garage. I lay back staring at the wooden beams of the shed roof. The anger was still there, burning in my gut, but it was controlled now. It was fuel. They had signed my death certificate. They thought Lucius King was a memory, a ghost to be forgotten. Well, they were half right. I was a ghost now. But I wasn't the kind that fades away. I was the kind that haunts. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I listened. I waited for the sun to rise. Because when the sun rose, Brad would wake up. He would make his coffee. He would make his calls. And I would be the shadow in the corner catching every word. The game had changed. They were playing for money. I was playing for souls. And I had just dealt myself a winning hand. The sun was setting over the estate, casting long shadows that looked like bars across the manicured lawn. It was supposed to be a celebration. My wife Odessa was turning 92 years old today. 92 years of grace and hard work and love. In a normal world, this day would be filled with her favorite lemon cake and the sound of her great-grandchildren laughing. But we were not living in a normal world. We were living in Brad's world. Brad had promised Tiana that he would throw a party for her mother. He called it a celebration of heritage. But as I trimmed the hedges near the patio, pretending to be the invisible gardener, I saw the truth. There were no balloons for Odessa. There was no family. Instead, the driveway was filling up with luxury cars, Porsches, Ferraris, Bentleys. The guests were not family friends. They were investors. Brad was using my wife's birthday as a backdrop for a product launch. He was selling some new high-tech investment scheme to a group of wealthy, disconnected socialites who wouldn't know dignity if it stared them in the face. I adjusted my grip on the heavy pruning shears. The metal was cool against my palm, but my blood was boiling hot. I kept my head down, pulling the brim of my hat lower, but my eyes missed nothing. Then I saw her. My heart stopped. Brad led Odessa out onto the patio. They hadn't dressed her in her Sunday best. They hadn't put her in the floral dress she loved. Brad had dressed her up like a prop. He had her wearing an old-fashioned apron and a head wrap. He had dressed the matriarch of the King family like a caricature of a servant from a century ago. She looked confused. Her eyes darted around the crowd, seeking a familiar face. She looked terrified. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brad announced, his voice booming with fake charisma, "I present to you the inspiration behind our traditional values initiative. This is Nana. She has been with the family forever, a true relic of a simpler time." The crowd applauded politely, sipping their champagne. They didn't see a human being. They saw a mascot, a novelty. Brad placed a hand on her frail shoulder. His grip looked tight, too tight. "Nana," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you sing for us? Sing one of those old spirituals you hum in the laundry room. Give our guests a taste of that authentic soul." Odessa shrank back. "I don't want to," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but I heard it. I heard the fear. "Come on now," Brad insisted, his smile tightening into a grimace. "Don't be shy. Sing." He handed her a silver tray with a bottle of vintage red wine and a glass. He was making her serve herself while she performed. It was a grotesque display of power. Odessa began to sing, and her voice was thin and shaky, cracking on the high notes. She sang a hymn about crossing the river to a better land. It was a song of sorrow and hope, but here in this circle of vultures it sounded like a cry for help. Her hands trembled under the weight of the heavy silver tray. The dementia made her balance poor, and the stress was making it worse. I took a step forward from the bushes. My muscles were coiled. I was ready to drop the act. Then it happened. A woman in a red dress laughed loudly at something a waiter said. The sudden noise startled Odessa. She flinched. The heavy silver tray tipped. The bottle of wine slid off. It didn't break, but the open neck splashed dark crimson liquid all over Brad's pristine white Italian loafers. The music stopped. The chatter died. The silence that descended on the patio was heavy and suffocating. Brad looked down at his shoes. Then he looked at Odessa. The mask of the charming businessman fell away instantly, revealing the monster underneath. "You stupid old hag," he snarled. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He swung his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound was like a whip crack. It echoed off the stone walls of the house. Odessa crumpled. She fell to the hard stone floor, her small body looking like a pile of discarded clothes. She didn't cry out. She just lay there, holding her cheek, too shocked to make a sound. "Mom!" Tiana screamed. She dropped her drink and started to rush forward. For 1 second, I saw the daughter I used to know, the girl who loved her mother. But then Brad turned to her. He didn't speak. He just glared. His eyes were cold, dead things. He looked at Tiana, and then he looked pointedly at the diamond bracelet on her wrist and the mansion behind her. The message was clear. You like this life. You like the money. You shut your mouth. Tiana froze. She looked at her husband. She looked at her mother lying on the ground, and then she looked down. She stopped moving. She let the fear win. She let the greed win. My vision went red. It wasn't a figure of speech. The world actually turned a shade of crimson. The sound of the party faded into a dull roar like the ocean in a storm. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I gripped the pruning shears. They were sharp enough to cut through a thick branch with a single snap. They would cut through a human throat just as easily. I started walking. I wasn't the gardener anymore. I wasn't the old man. I was Lucius King. I was the man who had survived wars and boardrooms and betrayals. I walked out of the shadows. 3 steps. I could reach him in 10. I visualized it, the blade entering the soft tissue under the jaw, the look of surprise in his eyes, the spray of blood that would match the wine on his shoes. It would be justice. It would be fast. It would be satisfying. I was 15 feet away. Brad was busy wiping his shoe, not even looking at the woman he had just assaulted. He was complaining to a guest about the cost of the leather, 10 feet away. I shifted the shears to a combat grip. Then I stopped. I froze mid-step. My breathing was ragged. Why did I stop? I looked at Brad. If I killed him now, it would be over. The police would come. I would go to prison for the rest of my short life. Tiana would inherit everything immediately. The debt to the mob would be paid off by his life insurance. Odessa would be put in a state home because Tiana wouldn't care for her alone. If I killed him now, I would only be solving the problem for myself. I would be venting my anger, but I wouldn't be saving my family. And death was too easy for him. A clean death was a mercy. It was an escape. Brad didn't deserve mercy. He deserved to feel what he had made us feel. He deserved to be stripped. He deserved to be humiliated. He deserved to lose the one thing he loved more than life itself. His money, his reputation, his ego. I wanted him to live long enough to see his empire turn to ash. I wanted him to be alive when he realized he was nothing. I stepped back into the shadows. The urge to kill was still there, vibrating in my bones, but I pushed it down. I locked it away in a cold iron box in my mind. I watched as a waiter helped Odessa up. Tiana stood uselessly to the side, wiping a tear but doing nothing. Brad laughed off the incident, ordering the band to play something upbeat. They went back to their party. They went back to drinking and laughing as if they hadn't just witnessed a crime. I turned and walked away. I went back to the shed. I closed the door and locked it. My hands were still shaking, but now they were steady enough for what I needed to do. I reached under the loose floorboard where I kept my emergency kit. I pulled out a satellite phone. It was old, heavy, and untraceable. I hadn't used it in 6 years. I prayed the number still worked. I dialed. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Click. A voice on the other end. Distorted. Mechanical. Identification. King of Spades, I said. My voice sounded like gravel. There was a pause. A long pause. Then the voice changed. It was human now. Surprised. Lucius, we thought you were dead. Not yet, I said. I'm calling in the favor. The Singapore job. You remember? I remember, the voice said. What do you need? I looked out the small, dusty window toward the main house where the lights were blazing and the music was thumping. I need the Alpha team, I said. I need a forensic accountant, a cyber warfare specialist, and a heavy cleanup crew, Target, the voice asked. I took a deep breath. Bradford Sterling, I said, and Janus Holdings. There was a low whistle on the other end. That's a mob front, Lucius. You're starting a war. I gripped the phone until the plastic creaked. They hit my wife, I said. The silence on the other end was heavy with understanding. In our world, that was the only justification needed. Understood, the voice said. We are activating. ETA 12 hours. What are the rules of engagement? I looked at the pruning shears sitting on the workbench. The blade glinted in the moonlight. Scorched earth, I whispered. Burn it all down. Leave him nothing but the suit on his back. I want him to wish he was dead. Copy that. Alpha team is moving. I hung up the phone. I sat there in the dark, listening to the distant sound of the party. Brad was laughing. I could hear his laugh drifting across the lawn. He was celebrating. He thought he was the king of the world. Let him laugh. Let him enjoy his champagne. Let him think he got away with it. Because tomorrow the sun wouldn't just rise. It would bring the fire. I looked at the photo of Odessa I kept in my wallet. I kissed her smiling face. Hold on, my love, I whispered. The cavalry is coming, and hell is coming with them. The morning sun rose over the estate, but it brought no warmth. The atmosphere was brittle like dry ice. It had been exactly 24 hours since Brad struck my wife across the face. 24 hours since I made the call that would end his world. I was out on the driveway, sweeping away invisible dust. I moved with the slow, rhythmic cadence of an old man who has nowhere else to be. But my eyes were sharp. I was watching the garage door. At 8 sharp, the heavy door rolled up. The silver Porsche slid out like a shark entering the water. Brad was behind the wheel. He was wearing dark sunglasses likely to hide the hangover from last night's adrenaline and alcohol. He looked important. He looked untouchable. He didn't know that 3 hours ago while the house slept I had paid a visit to that car. I hadn't cut the brake lines. That would be too obvious, too clumsy. A cut line leaves a puddle of fluid. A cut line screams sabotage. Instead, I had introduced a small bubble of air into the hydraulic system and loosened the caliper sensor on the front left wheel. It was a mechanic's ghost, a phantom failure. The brakes would work fine at low speeds, but the moment he applied sudden pressure, the system would hesitate. Just for a second. But a second is a lifetime in a high-performance machine. Brad gunned the engine. The exhaust note roared, echoing off the stone walls of the manor. He peeled out of the garage, accelerating too fast down the winding driveway. He wanted to feel powerful. I leaned on my broom and watched. At the end of the driveway, there was a sharp turn before the main gate. A massive cluster of ornamental hedge bushes lined the curve. Brad approached the turn. I saw his brake lights flare red, then they flickered. The hesitation happened exactly as I had calculated. The car didn't stop. It lurched. I heard the screech of tires losing grip on the asphalt. Then came the crunch. It wasn't the sound of a fatal impact. It was the sickening sound of fiberglass and expensive metal tearing against thick wood branches. The Porsche plowed nose first into the hedge. The front bumper shattered, sending shards of silver plastic flying into the air like confetti. The hood buckled. Smoke hissed from the radiator. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just kept sweeping. Brad kicked the door open. He stumbled out, his face purple with rage. He wasn't hurt. The airbags hadn't even deployed, but his pride was totaled. He walked around to the front of the car and screamed. It was a primal toddler-like scream. He kicked the crushed bumper and immediately grabbed his foot, hopping around in pain. I slowly walked over my broom, scratching against the pavement. "Sir," I said, my voice flat. "Are you all right?" He spun around wild-eyed. "The brakes," he shouted, spitting saliva. "The damn brakes didn't work. This is a $100,000 car and the brakes failed." He pulled out his phone and dialed the dealership, screaming threats that would make a sailor blush. He didn't see me inspecting the wheel well. I casually reached in and tightened the sensor back into place. By the time the tow truck arrived, the diagnostic computer would show nothing wrong. It would look like driver error. It would look like he lost control. The seed of doubt was planted. By noon, the mood in the house had shifted from tense to toxic. Brad was on a rampage. He was convinced that the world was conspiring against him. He couldn't accept that he was a bad driver, so he decided someone had to be blamed. He lined the staff up in the grand foyer. The cook, the 2 maids, the regular driver, even the pool boy. "You are all incompetent," he bellowed, pacing back and forth like a dictator. "How does a car just fail? Who was in the garage? Who touched it?" The staff looked at their feet, terrified. They needed these jobs. They had families. No one spoke. "Fine," Brad yelled. "You're all fired. Every single one of you. Get your things and get out. I want this house empty in an hour. I'll hire professionals who know how to respect my property." Tiana stood on the stairs watching. She looked pale. "Brad," she said softly, "you can't fire everyone. Who will cook? Who will clean?" "I don't care," Brad snapped. "I'd rather live in filth than with traitors." He turned and saw me standing by the door holding a bucket of fertilizer. He paused. He looked me up and down. I made myself look smaller. I let my mouth hang open slightly, giving him the impression of a simpleton who barely understood English. "Not you," he grunted, pointing a finger at my chest. "You stay. You were outside sweeping when it happened, and you're too stupid to know how to sabotage a car." I nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." He dismissed the others with a wave of his hand. I watched as the loyal staff who had served this house for years packed their bags in tears. I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it down. They were better off away from here. They were escaping a sinking ship. I was the one drilling the holes. Now we were alone. Just Brad, Tiana, the bedridden Odessa, and me. The isolation was part of the plan. Night fell heavy and cold. The forecast called for a frost. Perfect. I waited until lights out at 11. I went to the basement utility room. The HVAC system was a modern marvel of engineering controlled by a central computer. But like the car, it had physical vulnerabilities. I located the pressure relief valve for the hot water circulation system. I adjusted the tension spring. Then I went to the main thermostat control box on the wall. I bypassed the safety limiter. I commanded the system to heat the water to boiling, but I disabled the circulation pump for the second floor. Pressure would build, the pipes would expand, and the weakest joint would give way. I had identified the weakest joint 2 days ago. It was the connector valve right above the master bedroom. I went back to my shed and waited. At 2 in the morning, chaos erupted. It started with a loud bang like a gunshot inside the walls. Then came the sound of rushing water. I ran to the main house acting the part of the concerned servant. I found Brad and Tiana in the hallway. They were soaked. Water was spraying from the ceiling vent in their bedroom, turning their expensive silk sheets into a soggy mess. The water wasn't hot by the time it sprayed, but it was freezing cold coming from the ruptured main line mixing with the boiler water. "Do something!" Brad shrieked. He was shivering, his hair plastered to his skull. I ran to the basement and shut off the main valve. The water stopped, but the damage was done. The master bedroom was ruined. The carpet was a sponge. The mattress was destroyed. I came back upstairs with a toolbox. "It looks like a pressure surge, sir," I said, examining the vent. "Very rare. Bad luck." Brad was shaking uncontrollably. First the car, now the house. What is happening? He looked around the dark hallway. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, fear. He was beginning to feel like the universe was targeting him. I fixed the pipe temporarily. "You'll have to sleep in the guest room, sir," I said. "The heat is off for the night." He didn't argue. He just retreated to the guest room, dragging a wet blanket behind him. But I wasn't done. The physical attacks were just the softening up artillery. Now it was time for the chemical warfare. Brad was a health fanatic. Every morning with his coffee, he took a handful of supplements, vitamins, fish oil, and a proprietary blend of nootropics called Brain Force. He claimed they made him sharper, gave him an edge in business. I had found his stash in the kitchen pantry. I had also acquired something else. Through my contacts, the same ones who were sending the Alpha team, I had received a small package. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, but not a recreational dose. I wasn't trying to send him on a trip to the cosmos. I was microdosing him. I sat in the kitchen while the house was quiet. I carefully opened the capsules of his brain supplements. I used a dropper to add a minute amount of the liquid to each capsule, just enough to alter perception, just enough to make colors too bright, to make sounds too loud, to make the peripheral vision crawl with movement that wasn't there. I sealed the capsules back up and placed the bottle back on the shelf. The next morning, Brad came down to the kitchen. He looked exhausted. He grabbed the bottle and swallowed 3 pills with a gulp of black coffee. I was outside washing the windows. I watched him through the glass. 30 minutes later, it began. Brad was sitting at his laptop trying to work. Suddenly, he stopped typing. He rubbed his eyes. He looked at the painting on the wall. It was a modern abstract piece. He frowned. He tilted his head. To him, the shapes in the painting were starting to breathe. The red lines were pulsing like veins. He looked at his hands. He flexed his fingers. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked right at me. I stared back. My face was expressionless. Brad blinked. He shook his head violently. To him, my face might have been shifting. My eyes might have looked like black pits. "Who are you?" he whispered. I could read his lips through the glass. He turned away, pacing the kitchen. He was agitated. He picked up his phone to make a call, but then put it down as if the phone was too hot. The paranoia was setting in. The accidents were making him feel unsafe physically. The drugs were making him feel unsafe mentally. He was losing his anchor to reality. I continued to wash the window, the squeegee making a long, low squeaking sound against the glass. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Inside the kitchen, Brad covered his ears. The sound was probably screaming at him. He looked at the ceiling where the water had come from last night. He looked at the driveway where his car had crashed. He looked at the empty house, devoid of servants. He was the king of a crumbling castle, and the ghosts were coming out of the walls. I dipped my sponge into the bucket. The water was dark and murky. "Enjoy the ride, Brad," I whispered to myself. "We are just getting started." Tonight I would move the furniture a few inches while he slept. Tomorrow I would whisper his name through the vents. He wanted to be a big man. He wanted to control everything. Let's see how much control he has when he can't trust his own eyes. The investigation into his finances was running in the background. The Alpha team was digging into his accounts. But that was just numbers. This was personal. This was about breaking the man so that when the financial blow finally landed, he wouldn't have the strength to stand back up. I watched him pour another cup of coffee. His hand was shaking so badly he spilled it on the counter. He stared at the dark liquid spreading across the white marble. To him, it probably looked like blood. I wiped the window clean. All clear. The house was no longer just a building made of brick and mortar. It had become a living, breathing organism, and I was its central nervous system. I had spent the last 48 hours turning every smart device, every circuit, and every digital connection into a weapon of psychological warfare. Brad thought he was living in a modern mansion, but he was actually living in a haunted house where the ghosts were made of code and electricity. It was 3 in the morning on a Thursday, the kind of hour when the soul feels heaviest and the shadows in the corners of the room seem to stretch out like grasping fingers. I was awake in my shed watching the monitors, but Brad was awake too. He was in the main living room pacing back and forth on the Persian rug, wearing only his silk boxer shorts and a tattered robe. The microdose of LSD I had slipped into his morning coffee was wearing off, but the after effects were lingering. His movements were jerky. He kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to be standing there. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was always there watching through the camera lens hidden in the smoke detector. He collapsed onto the leather sofa, clutching a bottle of water. He looked exhausted. He just wanted to sleep. He closed his eyes, letting his head fall back against the cushion. Suddenly, the 80-inch television mounted on the wall roared to life. The volume was set to maximum. The sound of a breaking news alert exploded through the silent house like a grenade. Brad jumped so hard he spilled water all over himself. He scrambled for the remote control, his thumb mashing the power button. "Turn off!" he screamed. "Turn off, you piece of junk!" The screen went black. The silence returned. Brad panted, his chest heaving. He threw the remote onto the coffee table and leaned back again, closing his eyes. 5 seconds later, click. The TV turned back on. But this time it wasn't a random channel. I had programmed a specific stream to play. It was a pre-recorded news segment from a financial crime channel. The anchor's voice was stern and judgmental, filling the room. The FBI has launched a new crackdown on elder abuse and trust fund fraud. Perpetrators are facing up to 20 years in federal prison. Assets are being seized. There is nowhere to hide. Brad stared at the screen. The colors seemed too bright to him. The anchor's eyes seemed to be looking directly into his soul. "Stop it," he whimpered. He grabbed the remote and pulled the batteries out, throwing them across the room. The TV stayed on. I watched from my shed, my finger hovering over the enter key on my laptop. I had bypassed the infrared receiver. I was controlling the unit via the Wi-Fi network. The news anchor continued. "The most common sign of guilt is the concealment of assets, but the forensic accountants always find the trail." Brad let out a strangled cry and ran to the wall, yanking the power cord out of the socket. The screen finally died. He stood there trembling, holding the plug in his hand, breathing like a trapped animal. He thought he was losing his mind. He didn't know he was being hunted, but the psychological terror was just the opening act. Now it was time to hit him where it truly hurt. His wallet. I had gained access to his primary checking account the day before thanks to the keylogger I installed on his laptop. I wasn't going to drain the account dry. That would trigger a fraud alert from the bank and freeze everything. No, I was going to do something far more maddening. I had set up a script to execute a series of microtransactions. Every hour on the hour, a small amount of money was transferred out. Ding. Brad's phone lit up on the coffee table. He picked it up suspiciously. A notification from his banking app. Transfer complete. $200 to the Sunrise Home for Forgotten Seniors. Brad frowned. He swiped the screen. Another notification from an hour ago. Transfer complete. $300 to the Dementia Care Alliance. He scrolled back. $500 to the Legal Defense Fund for the Elderly. He wasn't being robbed by a criminal. In his mind, he was being robbed by karma. The specific nature of the charities was driving him insane. It was as if the money was developing a conscience of its own and fleeing his pockets to go where it was actually needed. No, he muttered, tapping furiously on the screen. "I didn't authorize this. Who is doing this?" He tried to log in to stop the transfers, but I had changed his password 10 minutes ago. Access denied. He threw the phone onto the couch and screamed a raw sound of frustration that echoed through the empty halls. "Tiana." He roared her name. In his twisted, paranoid logic, there was only one person who would send money to old people. Only one person who knew his passwords. Only one person who was angry about what happened to Odessa. Tiana, get down here. I left the shed. It was time to be the witness. I grabbed my mop and bucket and entered the house through the side door, moving silently into the hallway adjacent to the living room. I started mopping the floor, my movements slow and rhythmic, making myself part of the furniture. Tiana came down the stairs. She was wearing a silk nightgown, wrapping her arms around herself. She looked terrified. "What is it, Brad?" she whispered. "It's 3 a.m. Brad spun around. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils dilated. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he spat. "You think you can steal from me to pay for your mommy's care?" Tiana blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," Brad shouted, advancing on her. "The money, the transfers, thousands of dollars going to charity. You're the only one with access. You're trying to bleed me dry because I pushed the old hag." Tiana backed away until she hit the wall. "I didn't touch your money, Brad. I don't even know your passwords. You change them every week." "Liar," Brad screamed. He grabbed a vase from the side table and threw it. It shattered against the wall inches from Tiana's head. She screamed and covered her face. I kept mopping. Dip, swirl, ring. I was 10 feet away, but neither of them looked at me. To them, I was just the old man cleaning up the mess. "You want to see the money," Brad yelled. "You want to see what I have left." He stormed over to the large oil painting hanging above the fireplace. He ripped it off the wall, throwing it to the floor. Behind it was a heavy steel wall safe. "This is my money," he ranted. "My cash. The banks are against me. The cars are against me. But this is mine." He was losing control completely. The drugs, the lack of sleep, the fear, it all culminated in this moment of reckless stupidity. He needed to prove he still had power. He needed to see the cash to reassure himself that he was still the king. He grabbed the digital dial. He didn't block his view. He didn't lower his voice. "You think you can guess this code?" he screamed at Tiana. "You think you're smart enough? It's invincible." He spun the dial. 77, he shouted. I paused my mop. I memorized the number, 14. He spun it the other way, 32. I repeated the numbers in my head, 77, 14, 32, 9, beep, click. The heavy bolts retracted. Brad ripped the door open. He reached in and pulled out stacks of cash, hugging them to his chest. "See?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "It's still here. You can't touch this. This is my getaway fund. This is my blood." Tiana was crying now, sliding down the wall to the floor. "Brad, please stop. You're scaring me. You're having a breakdown." "Breakdown?" Brad laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound. "I am the only one who sees the truth. The house is trying to kill me, the car tried to kill me, and you are stealing from me." He shoved the money back into the safe and slammed the door shut. He spun the dial, locking it. "Get out of my sight," he hissed. "Go back to your room. If I see you touch my phone again, I will throw you and your mother out on the street tonight. I don't care if it's freezing. I will end you." Tiana scrambled up and ran up the stairs, sobbing. Brad stood there panting, staring at the safe. He leaned his forehead against the cold steel. I finished mopping the section of the floor near the doorway. I picked up my bucket. Brad turned and looked at me. For a second, his eyes cleared. He realized I had been there the whole time. "What are you looking at, old boy?" he growled. "Nothing, sir," I said, my voice raspy and subservient. "Just cleaning up the broken glass, sir, so no one cuts their feet." Brad sneered. "Useless. Everyone is useless." He turned off the lights and stumbled toward the kitchen, probably to find more alcohol to silence the voices in his head. I walked back to the utility room to dump the dirty water. I watched the dark swirl of water go down the drain. I had the combination. 77, 14, 32, 9. He had screamed his secrets to the world, thinking he was asserting dominance. Instead, he had just handed me the key to his coffin. I didn't need to break the safe. I didn't need drills or explosives. He had given it to me. I went back to the shed. The Alpha team was arriving in 2 hours. The forensic accountant would need those physical documents inside the safe to nail the coffin shut on the tax evasion charges. The cash would be evidence of money laundering. But more importantly, inside that safe was the leverage I needed to free Tiana. I sat down at my small desk and opened my notebook. I wrote down the combination. The ghost in the machine had done its job. Brad was broken. He was isolating himself, attacking his allies, and exposing his vulnerabilities. Tomorrow the final phase would begin. Tomorrow we wouldn't just haunt him, we would materialize. And when he finally saw me, when he finally realized who the old gardener really was, it would be too late to run. I looked at the monitor one last time. Brad was sitting at the kitchen island, head in his hands. "Sleep well, Brad," I whispered. "You're going to need your rest, because you're about to have a very busy day." The house was quiet in the way a battlefield is quiet after the mortars stop falling. Brad was barricaded in his study, probably staring at the wall safe or trying to piece together the shredded remains of his sanity. The drugs and the paranoia had done their work. He was isolated in his own mind. Now it was time to isolate Tiana. I knew my daughter. I knew that beneath the layers of designer clothes and the mask of indifference she wore like armor, there was still the little girl who used to cry when she found a wounded bird. She wasn't evil, she was weak, she was trapped, and for the last 5 years she had been living with a monster who had convinced her that she had no other choice. I watched her from the shadows of the hallway. She was wandering aimlessly through the house. She looked like a prisoner in a 5-star hotel. She touched the expensive vases and the silk drapes, but there was no joy in her touch. She looked terrified. I had prepared the bait earlier that morning. I went to the small secret compartment in my old toolbox, the one thing I had managed to keep hidden in the shed. Inside were the treasures of a life that no longer existed. Not diamonds, not gold, but things that actually mattered. I took out a small wooden doll. It was crude, carved from a piece of aromatic cedar. I had made it for her when she was 6 years old because we couldn't afford the fancy plastic ones at the store. One of the arms was slightly shorter than the other, but she had loved it more than anything. She used to sleep with it under her pillow. I also took out a photograph. It was a Polaroid, faded now. It showed Tiana on the day of her high school graduation. She wasn't wearing expensive jewelry. She was wearing a cheap gown and a cardboard cap, but her smile was blinding. I was standing next to her, my arm around her shoulder, looking at her like she was the only star in the sky. I placed these items on the stone bench in the solarium. It was her favorite place to hide when Brad was on a rampage. It was the only room in the house that smelled like life because of the orchids I tended to daily. I retreated to the corner, pretending to prune a ficus tree. 10 minutes later, she drifted in. She was wearing an oversized sweater and no makeup. She looked so young and so tired. She sat down on the bench heavily, her shoulders slumping. Then she saw them. She froze. Her hand reached out, trembling, hovering over the wooden doll. She didn't pick it up at first, as if she was afraid it was a hallucination, as if Brad's madness was contagious. She touched the wood. She traced the uneven arm. Then she picked up the photo. I saw her breath hitch. Her shoulders began to shake. A sound escaped her lips, a low keen of pure grief that tore at my heart. She curled around the items, clutching them to her chest, rocking back and forth. I put down my shears. I walked over to her, slowly making sure my footsteps were audible so I wouldn't startle her. "Miss," I said softly. My voice was the gravelly rasp of the old boy. She jumped, wiping her eyes frantically, trying to compose herself. She tried to put the mask back on, but it was too late. The cracks were too wide. "I'm fine," she stammered. "I'm fine. Just go back to work." I didn't move. I stood a respectful distance away, holding my hat in my hands. "You don't look fine, miss," I said. "You look like someone who is carrying a mountain on her back." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "What would you know about it? You're just the gardener." I looked at the photo in her hand. "That looks like a happy day," I said, pointing a calloused finger. "Your father looked very proud." Tiana stared at the photo. Her tears started falling again, hot and fast. "He was," she whispered, "he was the best man I ever knew. And I let him down. I let him down so bad." I took a step closer. "Why do you say that?" "Because I'm here," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "Because I'm living in this house built on lies. Because I signed papers I shouldn't have signed. Because I married a man who turned out to be—" She stopped. She looked around fearfully, checking the corners for listening devices. "Who turned out to be what, miss?" I asked gently. "A devil," she whispered. She looked up at me, and for the first time she really saw me. Not as a servant, but as another human being. She was desperate to confess. She was desperate for someone to tell her she wasn't crazy. "He says he'll kill me," she said. The words rushed out of her like water from a broken dam. "If I leave him. If I try to access the money. If I tell anyone about the loans, he said he would make it look like an accident, just like—" She covered her mouth. "Just like he made my father's death look like an accident." The air in the solarium went still. The truth was out. She hadn't killed me. She hadn't planned it. She had been coerced. She believed I was dead, and she believed Brad had done it. She was living with the man she thought murdered her father because she was terrified she would be next. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, so powerful my knees almost buckled. She was a victim, not a villain. I moved closer. I sat down on the bench next to her. A gardener does not sit with the mistress of the house. It was a breach of protocol. Tiana looked at me, shocked by my boldness. "What are you doing?" I looked into her eyes, the same eyes I had looked into the day she was born. "He can't hurt you anymore, Tiana," I said. My voice changed. I dropped the raspy accent. I spoke with my true voice, deep, resonant, the voice that used to read her bedtime stories. She froze, her pupils dilated. She pulled back, pressing herself against the stone wall. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Why did you say my name like that?" I didn't answer with words, not yet. Words can be lies. Bodies tell the truth. I held out my right hand. I placed it palm down on the bench between us. It was an old hand weathered by sun and soil, but on the back of the hand, right between the thumb and the forefinger, was a scar. It was white and jagged, shaped like a perfect letter V. It happened when Tiana was 7. We were fishing. I had snagged a hook deep in my skin. She had cried and held my hand while the doctor stitched it up. She used to trace that scar when she was anxious. It was her safety anchor. Tiana stared at the hand. She stared at the scar. The world seemed to stop spinning. I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. I could hear the beat of my own heart. She reached out. Her finger trembled as she touched the white line of the scar. She traced the V. She looked up at my face. She looked past the beard. She looked past the wrinkles. She looked into my eyes. "Daddy," she breathed. It was barely a whisper, a sound so fragile it might have broken if the wind blew. I nodded slowly. She opened her mouth to scream, to cry out in joy and shock, to alert the whole house that the dead had risen. I moved instantly. I grabbed her shoulders and pulled her close, placing a finger firmly over her lips. "Shh," I hissed. Not a sound. She collapsed against my chest, sobbing silently into my dirty work shirt. Her whole body shook with the force of her release. It was the cry of a child who has been lost in the dark for years and finally sees a light. I held her. I smoothed her hair just like I used to. I felt her tears soaking through the fabric. "I'm here, baby girl," I whispered. "I'm here. I didn't die. I had to go away to survive, but I came back for you. I came back for Mama." She pulled back, looking at me with wild, desperate eyes. "Brad," she gasped. "If he knows, if he finds out—" "He won't know," I said, my voice hard as steel. "Not until we are ready." I gripped her shoulders and looked her dead in the eye. "Listen to me, Tiana. This is the most important thing you have ever done. You have to stop crying. You have to wipe your face." "But you're alive," she stammered, touching my cheek as if to verify I was real. "We can leave. We can just run." "No," I said. "We don't run. We don't retreat. We end this." I told her the plan. Not all of it, just enough. I told her about the team coming. I told her about the evidence I had gathered. "He is going down, Tiana," I said. "He is going to lose everything. The money, the house, the freedom. But I need you to be strong. I need you to go back in there and be the scared wife for one more day. Can you do that?" She took a deep breath. She looked at the wooden doll in her lap. She looked at the scar on my hand. She straightened her back. I saw the fear in her eyes recede, replaced by a cold, burning anger. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a king. "I can do it," she said. "Good." I stood up. I picked up my shears. I became the gardener again. The transition was instant. "Keep the doll," I said. "Hide it. When you feel afraid, hold it and remember that the cavalry is already inside the walls." She nodded. She stood up and smoothed her dress. She didn't look back at me. She walked out of the solarium with her head high. I watched her go. Brad thought he had isolated her. He thought he had broken her spirit, but he had made a fatal mistake. He had forgotten that blood is thicker than water and far thicker than money. I went back to pruning the ficus. Snip, snip. The pieces were all on the board now. The trap was set. The allies were united. Tomorrow Brad Sterling would face his judgment, and he wouldn't be facing a senile old woman and a terrified wife. He would be facing the combined wrath of a family that he had tried to bury. I cut a dead branch off the tree and let it fall to the floor. Clean up on aisle 5, I whispered to the empty room. The war did not begin with an explosion. It began with the soft, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard inside a nondescript van parked 3 blocks away. My Alpha team had arrived. They were invisible to the naked eye, but their presence was felt in every fiber of the digital world surrounding the estate. I sat in my shed listening to the comms link in my ear. I was pruning a basket of hydrangeas, my hands working the shears with practiced ease while my mind was synchronized with the destruction of Brad Sterling's empire. "Target acquired," said a voice in my ear. It was the kid, my lead cyber specialist. "We have bypassed the firewall on his private equity firm. Accessing the ledger now." I didn't speak. I just hummed a low tune, a signal that I was listening. The second voice chimed in. It was the Shark, my former corporate attorney who knew where every financial body was buried. "I'm looking at these files, Lucius. It's worse than we thought. He's not just laundering money. He's running a Ponzi scheme. He's using new investor money to pay off the interest on the mob loans. He is robbing Peter to pay Paul, but Paul is holding a gun." "Release the hounds," I whispered. The attack was surgical. At 9 in the morning, Brad sat in his home office trying to project an image of success. He was on a video call with potential investors, smiling that predatory smile of his. Then his screen flickered. A notification popped up in the corner, then another, then a cascade. I was in the hallway polishing the baseboards so I could hear everything. "What is this?" Brad muttered. He clicked his mouse frantically. His email inbox began to flood, not with spam, but with automated alerts from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. The 3 letters that make grown men in suits wet the bed. Subject: Notice of investigation regarding Bradford Sterling. Subject: Freeze of assets pending audit. Subject: Subpoena for digital records. Brad's face went the color of ash. He stammered an excuse to the investors and slammed his laptop shut, but closing the lid doesn't stop the fire. His phone began to ring. It was his personal banker. I could hear the voice on the other end, loud and panicked. "Mr. Sterling, your accounts have been flagged. We have a federal hold on all liquidity. You cannot withdraw. You cannot transfer." Brad stood up, knocking his chair over. He ran his hands through his hair, pulling at the roots. "No, no, no," he screamed. "This is a mistake. This is a glitch." He tried to log into his offshore accounts, the ones he thought were hidden in the Cayman Islands. Access denied. The kid had done his work. We hadn't just reported him. We had locked him out of his own life. Brad was pacing the room like a caged tiger. He was hyperventilating. He knew what was coming. The SEC investigation would take months, but the mob wouldn't wait that long. The loan shark Janus Holdings expected a payment of $200,000 by Friday. If he missed it, they wouldn't send a letter. They would send a hitman. He needed cash. Clean, untraceable cash. And he needed it now. He looked out the window at the sprawling estate, the pool, the tennis court, the manicured gardens I had tended with my own hands. He didn't see a home. He saw a life raft. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. Not a real estate agent. An agent would ask questions. An agent would take months. He dialed a contact he had met in the shadowy corners of the underground gambling world. "I need a buyer," he hissed into the phone. "Today. Cash. No questions asked." "Yes, I know the market value is $15 million. I don't care. I'll take 7. 7 million cash. But it has to be done by sunset." I smiled as I wiped a smudge of dust from the floor. 7 million. He was selling my $20 million legacy for pennies on the dollar because he was terrified. He didn't know that the contact on the other end of the phone was also on my payroll. 2 hours later, a black SUV with tinted windows rolled up the driveway. It looked menacing. It looked exactly like the kind of vehicle Brad expected. Out stepped a man. He was huge, a mountain of muscle in a bespoke suit. He had a shaved head and a thick scar running down his cheek. We called him Victor. In reality, he was a soft-spoken actor I had hired for corporate espionage jobs in the past, but today he was playing the role of a ruthless Russian oligarch looking to launder some money of his own. Brad rushed out to meet him, sweating profusely. "Mr. Victor," Brad said, extending a shaking hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Victor didn't shake his hand. He just looked at the house with a sneer. "This is it," Victor rumbled, his voice thick with a fake accent. "It is acceptable. Small, but acceptable." Brad swallowed hard. "It's a prime estate. 15 acres. Marble from Italy. It's worth double what I'm asking." "7 million, Victor said, cutting him off. "Cash. In a briefcase. In my car. Take it or leave it." "I'll take it," Brad said too quickly. The desperation was pouring off him like a foul smell. "We need signatures," Victor said. "You and the wife. The deed is in both names, yes?" Brad nodded feverishly. Yes. She's inside. She'll sign. She does what I tell her. I was already inside. I had found Tiana in the kitchen. She was clutching the wooden doll I had given her. She looked pale, but her eyes were steady. "It's happening," I told her. "The buyer is here. It's one of us. You just have to sign." "But the house," she whispered. "We're losing the house." I took her hands. "We are not losing anything. You are selling the house to a shell corporation that I own. We are buying our own house back, Tiana, and we are using Brad's panic to do it. He thinks he is saving himself, but he is signing away his only leverage." She nodded, taking a deep breath. She put the doll in her pocket. "I'm ready," she said. Brad burst into the kitchen. He looked manic. "Tiana, get into the living room. Now." "There is a man there. He is buying the house." "What?" Tiana asked, feigning shock. "Brad, we can't sell the house. Where will we live?" "What about Mama?" "Shut up," Brad hissed, grabbing her arm. "We are selling it. We have to. It's business. You will sign the papers and you will smile. Do you understand? If you don't sign, I will leave you here with the debt. I will leave you to rot." He dragged her into the living room where Victor was waiting like a statue. "This is my wife," Brad said, pushing Tiana forward. "She is ready to sign." Victor placed a stack of documents on the coffee table. Next to it, he placed a heavy metal briefcase. He opened the case. It was filled with stacks of $100 bills. Brad's eyes bulged. He looked at the money like a starving man looks at a feast. He reached out to touch it, but Victor slammed the case shut. "Signatures first," Victor said. Brad grabbed the pen. He signed his name so hard he almost tore the paper. He was signing away his rights. He was signing away his claim to the property. He was legally evicting himself. "Now you," Victor said, looking at Tiana. Tiana picked up the pen. Her hand trembled. She looked at Brad. "Brad, please," she whimpered. "This is our home. Sign it." Brad snarled through gritted teeth. She signed. Victor checked the papers. He nodded. He pushed the briefcase toward Brad. "Done," he said. "The house is mine. You have 24 hours to vacate. After that, I change the locks." 24 hours. Brad laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "I'll be gone in 2. I just need my clothes and my car." He grabbed the briefcase. He hugged it. He thought he had won. He thought he had $7 million to run away with. He didn't know that the serial numbers on those bills were flagged by the FBI. He didn't know that the moment he tried to spend that money, he would be lighting a flare for every federal agent in the country. I walked into the room carrying a tray with tea. "Refreshments, sir?" I asked, looking at Victor. Victor looked at me. For a split second, his eyes twinkled with recognition, but he kept his face stone cold. "No tea," Victor said. "I do not drink with peasants." Brad laughed. "You see, old boy, even the new owner knows you're worthless. Get out of here. Go pack your trash. You're fired, too." I bowed my head. "Yes, sir." "Whatever you say, sir." I walked back to the kitchen. I put the tray down. I watched Brad running up the stairs, clutching the briefcase 2 steps at a time. He was running to pack his bag. He was running toward a freedom that was actually a cage. The audit was complete. The asset was secured. The enemy was disarmed. I pulled out my phone and sent a text message to the Alpha team. Phase 1 complete. The rat has the cheese. Close the trap. Tonight, Brad would try to flee the country. Tonight, he would drive that Porsche to the private airfield where he had chartered a plane. But he wouldn't make it to the plane, because the car had a GPS tracker, and the police had just received an anonymous tip about a man fleeing the jurisdiction with $7 million in stolen funds. I walked to the window and looked out at the sun dipping below the horizon. The sky was the color of a bruise. It was almost over. But before the police took him, I had one last appointment with Mr. Sterling. He needed to know who really beat him. He needed to know that the checkmate didn't come from the SEC or the mob. It came from the gardener. I went to the closet and pulled out my old suit. It was dusty, but it was a bespoke Italian cut. I shaved my beard standing in front of the small mirror in the pantry. The face that stared back was older, harder, but it was Lucius King. I adjusted my tie. "It's showtime," I whispered. The storm outside was mirroring the chaos inside the house. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows like handfuls of gravel, and the wind howled through the eaves. But the real turbulence was in the living room where Brad Sterling was trying to force the final piece of his salvation into place. I was standing in the shadows of the hallway, my hand resting on the hidden panel that controlled the estate's main breaker. I had been waiting for this moment. The buyer, my man Victor, had demanded one last thing before the funds could be fully cleared: a quitclaim deed signed by the original title holder, Mama Odessa. Brad was desperate. He had the cash briefcase in his car, but he knew that without this paper the transfer could be flagged and the money seized. He needed that signature to make the $7 million real. I watched through the crack in the door. Brad had dragged Odessa out of her room. She was sitting in a high-backed chair looking small and terrified. Tiana was standing nearby crying silently, her hand in her pocket clutching the wooden doll I had given her. "Just put your thumb on the paper," Brad shouted. His voice was raw. He was sweating through his shirt. "Why do you have to be so difficult, you useless old woman? It's just a fingerprint. You can't even write your name anymore, so just give me the thumb." Odessa clenched her fist. She didn't understand the legal implications, but she understood the malice. She knew this man was bad. She knew he was hurting her family. In her dementia, she had found a core of iron obstinacy. "No," she whispered. "Not yours. My house. Lucius's house." Brad screamed a sound of pure frustration. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was brutal. He tried to pry her fingers open to press her thumb onto the ink pad. "Let her go!" Tiana cried, stepping forward. "You're hurting her, Brad. Stop it!" Brad backhanded the air, forcing Tiana to retreat. "Stay back. I am doing this. I am saving us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small case. Inside was a syringe, a sedative. I recognized the label. It was a heavy-duty tranquilizer he used for his back spasms. "If she won't do it willingly, she'll do it while she sleeps," Brad hissed. He uncapped the needle. That was the line. He was about to assault my wife with a chemical weapon. He was about to cross from cruelty into physical violation. I didn't hesitate. I didn't breathe. I pulled the lever. Kerchunk. The sound of the main breaker tripping was heavy and final. Instantly, the house was plunged into absolute darkness. The storm clouds blocked the moon so there was no ambient light. The living room became a cavern of ink. I heard Brad gasp. "What the hell? The power. Why is the power out?" I moved. I knew this house better than I knew the back of my own hand. I knew that the floorboard by the sofa creaked. I knew exactly where the coffee table was. I moved through the darkness like a wraith. I slipped past Tiana. I touched her shoulder briefly, a signal we had agreed upon. She grabbed her mother's hand and pulled her down to the floor behind the heavy velvet sofa. They were safe. Now it was just me and Brad. I put on the night vision goggles I had taken from my tactical kit. The room exploded into green clarity. I could see Brad standing in the center of the room holding the syringe, waving it blindly in the dark. He was spinning around, terrified. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice trembled. "Is that you, Victor? This isn't funny." I didn't answer. I stepped heavily with my boots. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't the shuffle of a gardener. It was the rhythmic, disciplined march of a soldier, the sound of a man coming to collect a debt. Brad froze. "Who is that? Show yourself." I activated the small directional speaker I had placed in the ceiling vents earlier that day. I spoke into my throat mic, my voice modulated to be deeper, slower, terrifying. "You woke the Grim Reaper, Brad." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It filled the room with a low, vibrating menace. Brad screamed. He dropped the syringe. I heard it shatter on the floor. "Get away from me," he shrieked. He fumbled at his waistband. I saw the glint of metal. A gun. A snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver. He had been carrying it since the threats from the mob started. He pointed the gun into the darkness. I picked up a heavy crystal vase from the side table and threw it across the room. It smashed against the fireplace wall. Brad spun around and fired. Bang! The muzzle flash lit up the room for a split second like a strobe light. In that flash, he saw nothing but shadows. "Stay back!" he screamed, firing again. Bang! I moved closer. I was 10 feet away. I whispered into the mic again. "You can't shoot a ghost, Brad. I am the house. I am the rot in the walls. I am the debt you owe." He was hyperventilating now. The drugs I had been feeding him combined with the darkness and the fear had broken his reality. He wasn't seeing an empty room. He was seeing demons. He was seeing the consequences of his sins manifesting as monsters. He fired again wildly. The bullet shattered the sliding glass door. Rain and wind roared into the room, adding to the cacophony. I stood right in front of him, just out of reach. I breathed loudly, a harsh rasping sound. He pointed the gun at me, but he couldn't see me. He just felt the presence of something vast and angry. "Leave me alone," he sobbed. "Take the money, take the house, just leave me alone. You can't pay for a soul with money," I whispered. He fired the last 3 rounds. Click, click, click. The gun was empty. He threw it at me. It bounced harmlessly off my chest. He fell to his knees, covering his head, curling into a fetal ball. "Please," he moaned. "Please wake up. Please wake up." I heard the sirens in the distance. The neighbors must have reported the gunshots. Perfect timing. I retreated to the service entrance. I took off the goggles and the tactical gear, hiding them in the prepared vent. I put my gardener's cap back on. I pulled the backup lever, restoring the emergency lights only. A dim, eerie amber glow filled the hallway. The front door burst open. "Police, drop your weapons." 3 officers stormed in flashlights, cutting through the gloom. They found Brad kneeling in the center of the room, surrounded by shattered glass and bullet holes, screaming about demons. They found Tiana and Odessa huddled safely behind the sofa, weeping. They found me, the old gardener, cowering in the kitchen doorway, holding a broom for protection. Officers, one cop shouted, training his gun on Brad. "Hands on your head. Now." Brad looked up. He was drooling. His eyes were wide and unseeing. "They're here," he babbled, pointing at the empty air. "The Reapers. The soldiers. They're in the walls. Don't let them take me." He lunged at the officer, grabbing his vest, begging for protection. The officer didn't see a victim. He saw a violent assailant high on narcotics who had just discharged a weapon in a house with a child and an elderly woman. "Get him off!" the cop yelled. They tackled Brad to the ground. He fought them, kicking and screaming, possessed by his terror. It took 3 of them to cuff him. "There was someone here," Brad screamed as they dragged him out. "There was a man in the dark. A giant. He spoke to me. Check the cameras. You have to check the cameras." The lead detective looked at Tiana. "Ma'am, is there a security system?" Tiana nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes, the server is in the study." I led them to the study. I stood innocently in the corner as the detective pulled up the feed from the last 20 minutes. I had the kid. My hacker edit the feed in real time. It was a masterpiece of digital manipulation. On the screen, the police saw the living room. They saw Brad standing alone. There was no darkness on the camera feed because the infrared mode had kicked in. They saw Brad talking to thin air. They saw him throw a vase at the wall himself. They saw him pull a gun and shoot at an empty corner. They saw him screaming at nothing. There was no soldier. There was no giant, just a man having a violent psychotic break. The detective shook his head. "He's tripping hard. Looks like a bad batch of something synthetic." He turned to me. "You work here. Has he been acting strange?" I nodded, my hands trembling just enough to sell the performance. "Yes, officer. He has been seeing things for days. He talks to the walls. He says the house is trying to eat him. I tried to stay out of his way. I was scared for the women." The detective patted my shoulder. "You did good calling us. He's going away for a long time. Assault with a deadly weapon, child endangerment, reckless discharge, and looking at his eyes, probably possession of a controlled substance." They dragged Brad out into the rain. He was still screaming about the Grim Reaper. As they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, he looked back at the house. He saw me standing in the window. I wasn't hunching anymore. I was standing tall. I slowly raised my hand and tapped my temple. I saw the realization hit him. The horror. He knew then. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was the gardener. But who would believe him now? The cruiser drove away, lights flashing red and blue against the stormy sky. I turned back to the room. Tiana was helping Odessa sit up. The nightmare was leaving the property. But the work wasn't done. Brad was in a cell, but his signature was still on the deed selling the house to my shell company. The trap had snapped shut. He had lost his freedom, his sanity, and his assets in a single night. I walked over to Odessa. She was shaken, but unharmed. "It's okay, Mama," I said softly. "The bad man is gone." She looked at me. Her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. "Lucius," she said, "you need to fix the window. It's letting the rain in." I smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I'm on it, Odessa. I'm on it." The silence in the house was deceptive. To an outsider, it looked like a peaceful morning, but inside the walls, invisible currents were shifting. Money is like water. It flows where gravity takes it, and for the last 5 years, gravity had been pulling everything toward Brad Sterling. But today, we were reversing the flow. We were making the river run uphill. Brad was out on bail. His expensive lawyers had worked a miracle getting him released pending the investigation into the shooting incident. They blamed stress. They blamed a bad reaction to medication. They painted him as a victim of exhaustion. He was back in the house, but he was a wounded animal now. Dangerous, unpredictable, and like all wounded animals, he was looking for something to bite. Tiana was ready. We had spoken in the early hours of the morning while the house slept. I had given her the instructions. She wasn't just my daughter anymore, she was my operative. She had walked into the lion's den armed with nothing but a pen and a terrifying amount of courage. She sat in the library with the forensic accountant I had smuggled in under the guise of a pool cleaner. They were moving fast. The Cayman Island accounts, the shell companies, the joint assets. One by one, she was signing them over to a blind trust, a trust that Brad couldn't touch, a trust that would secure the future of this family long after Brad was a bad memory. I was polishing the banister on the second-floor landing. My movements were slow and rhythmic, but my ears were tuned to the frequency of the house. I heard the front door open. Brad was home early. He wasn't supposed to be back until noon. He was supposed to be at his lawyer's office. But here he was, storming through the front door with the chaotic energy of a hurricane. He had been drinking. I could smell the scotch from the top of the stairs. It mingled with the smell of his expensive cologne, creating a scent that I will always associate with fear. He didn't go to his study. He went straight for the library. He knew. Somehow he knew. Maybe he had a notification on his phone. Maybe his banker had called him in a panic. I moved. I didn't run. Servants don't run. But I glided down the stairs with a speed that defied my gray hair. I reached the bottom of the stairs just as the library door crashed open. "You traitor!" Brad's voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, guttural growl. He stood in the doorway staring at Tiana and the accountant. Papers were spread across the mahogany desk. The evidence of his undoing was right there in black and white. Tiana stood up. She was trembling, but she didn't look away. "I'm securing my future, Brad," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "Since you seem intent on burning this house down, I'm making sure I don't burn with you." Brad's face turned a color I had never seen before, a deep, mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged like cords. He looked at the accountant, who was hurriedly packing his laptop. "Get out," Brad hissed. The accountant looked at Tiana. She nodded. "Go." The man scurried past Brad, avoiding eye contact. Now it was just the husband and the wife, and the old gardener watching from the shadows of the foyer. "You think you can steal from me?" Brad said, stepping into the room. "You think you can take my money? I made you. You were nothing before me. Just a daddy's girl with a dead father. I'm taking back what was my father's," Tiana said. "And I'm leaving you, Brad. It's over." That was the trigger. Brad didn't think. He reacted. The violence that had been simmering under his skin for years finally boiled over. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed Tiana by the hair. She screamed, a sharp, terrified sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "You aren't going anywhere," he shouted, pulling her face close to his. "You belong to me. You and this house and every cent in those accounts. You don't get to leave until I say you can leave." He raised his right hand. His fist was clenched. It wasn't a slap he was preparing. It was a punch meant to break bone, a punch meant to silence her forever. Tiana squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. The fist came down, but it never landed. I was there. I didn't remember moving across the foyer. One moment I was by the stairs, the next I was between them. My left hand shot up. I caught his wrist mid-swing. The sound of flesh hitting flesh was loud, a sharp slap that stopped the room cold. Brad stopped. He looked down. He saw a calloused, dirty hand gripping his wrist. He looked up. He saw the old gardener. But he didn't see the subservient old man anymore. He saw eyes that were cold and hard as flint. He saw a posture that was straight and dangerous. "Let go of me, old man," Brad snarled. "Do you want to die?" I didn't let go. I tightened my grip. My fingers dug into the pressure points on his wrist. The tendons shifted under my thumb. "No, sir," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any accent. It was the voice of Lucius King. "I don't want to die, and I don't want you to hit my daughter." Brad's eyes widened. He heard it. He heard the slip. "My daughter." "What did you say?" he whispered. I didn't answer with words. I answered with physics. I stepped in, closing the distance. I rotated my hip and twisted his wrist outward while simultaneously driving my elbow into his forearm. It was a simple technique. Aikido calls it kote geishi. The street calls it a wrist lock. There was a sickening pop. It sounded like a dry branch snapping in the winter woods. Brad screamed. It was a high-pitched sound of pure agony. His knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, clutching his hand, which was now bent at an impossible angle. Tiana gasped, covering her mouth. I stood over him. I adjusted my cuffs. "Careful with that hand, master," I said softly, looking down at him. "Bones are so fragile when you use them for violence." Brad was writhing on the carpet, tears streaming down his face. "You broke it," he sobbed. "You broke my wrist. You crazy old psycho. I'll kill you. I'll have you arrested." I looked at Tiana. She was staring at me with awe. "Go to your room," I told her. "Lock the door." She nodded and ran. I looked back at Brad. He was trying to crawl toward his phone, which had fallen on the floor. I kicked the phone away. It slid under the heavy oak desk. "We have a problem, sir," I said, crouching down beside him. My voice went back to the raspy whisper of the gardener. "You are very clumsy. You really should watch where you are going." "What are you talking about?" Brad wheezed, holding his swelling wrist. I grabbed him by the collar. He tried to fight, but the pain in his arm made him weak. I hauled him up. I dragged him out of the library and into the foyer. We stood at the bottom of the grand staircase. "You fell, sir," I said. "You were drunk. You were running down the stairs to catch your wife and you slipped. You put your hand out to break your fall and snap. A terrible accident." Brad looked at me with horror. "You're going to push me." "No," I said. "I don't need to push you. The injury is already consistent with a fall. But we need to make sure the rest of you matches the story." I shoved him hard. Not down the stairs, but into the heavy wooden newel post at the base of the banister. His shoulder struck the wood with a thud. "There," I said, brushing off my hands. "Now you have the bruising to match." I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I dialed 911. "Emergency," the operator said. I put panic into my voice. "Please help, it's Mr. Sterling." He fell. He fell down the stairs. I think his arm is broken. He's screaming. "Please hurry." I hung up. Brad was staring at me from the floor. He was cradling his broken wrist, his face pale with shock. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Who the hell are you really?" I leaned in close. My face was inches from his. I let him see the scar on my hand. I let him see the fire in my eyes. "I'm the one who knocks Brad. I'm the one who cleans up the trash. And right now, you look very messy." The sirens began to wail in the distance. "Remember," I hissed, "you fell. If you say anything else, if you say the old gardener knows martial arts, they will put you in the psych ward next to the people who see aliens. You are already on bail. You are already unstable. Do you really want to tell the police that an old man with a bad back overpowered you?" Brad closed his eyes. He realized the trap. If he told the truth, he looked crazy. If he lied, he admitted defeat. He was checkmated. The paramedics arrived in a flurry of activity. They loaded him onto a stretcher. He moaned in pain as they stabilized his wrist. "What happened, sir?" the medic asked. Brad looked at me. I was standing by the door, holding his hat, looking like a worried servant. I fell," he croaked. "I tripped on the stairs." I smiled internally. "We will take good care of the house, sir," I called out as they wheeled him away. "Don't you worry about a thing." The doors closed. The ambulance drove away. I closed the front door and locked it. The click of the deadbolt was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. I walked back to the library. I picked up the phone that I had kicked under the desk. I placed it back on the table. Then I went to the kitchen and made a pot of herbal tea. Tiana would need it. We had crossed the Rubicon. There was no going back now. He was broken physically. His money was gone. His wife was gone. But the final blow was yet to come. The hospital would run blood tests. They would find the alcohol. They would find the sedatives. And they would find the traces of the hallucinogens I had been feeding him. By tomorrow morning, Brad Sterling wouldn't just be an injured man. He would be a man deemed incompetent to manage his own affairs. I took a sip of tea. It tasted like victory. I walked up the stairs past the spot where he supposedly fell. I didn't look down. I looked up. The portrait of my father hung at the top of the landing. I had hung it there myself yesterday, replacing a tacky, abstract piece Brad had bought. I winked at the painting. "Almost done, Dad," I whispered. "Almost done." The silence that hung over the estate was no longer the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a crypt. Brad Sterling had returned from the hospital, but the man who walked through the front door was a hollow shell of the tyrant who used to rule these halls. His right arm was encased in a heavy white plaster cast a physical monument to his arrogance. His eyes were darting around the foyer, scanning the shadows for monsters that only he could see. I was there polishing the mirror in the hallway. I watched his reflection. He looked gray. The expensive tan he cultivated on his yacht trips had faded, leaving his skin looking like old parchment. He didn't bark orders. He didn't kick off his shoes. He walked with a limp, clutching a bottle of painkillers like a holy relic. He went straight to the kitchen. He needed water for his pills. He needed to numb the throbbing in his wrist and the screaming in his mind. I had placed the package on the kitchen island exactly 10 minutes ago. It was a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address, just his name written in block letters with a heavy black marker. Brad froze when he saw it. He stared at the box as if it were a bomb. In his current state of mind, everything was a threat. The toaster was suspicious. The refrigerator hummed with malice. And this box, sitting in the center of his granite island, was a direct violation of his sanctuary. He looked at me. I was busy wiping the counter, my head bowed. "Did you bring this in?" he asked. His voice was raspy, dry from the hospital air and the fear. "Yes, sir," I said softly. "The courier dropped it off this morning. I thought it might be important." Brad approached the box slowly. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers trembling. He ripped the paper. It tore with a loud sound that made him flinch. Inside was a black velvet jewelry box, the kind you get from high-end jewelers, the kind that usually holds promises of love or displays of wealth. He opened the lid. The sound that escaped his throat was not human. It was a strangled gasp, a sudden intake of air that got stuck in his chest. Sitting on the black velvet cushion was a watch. It wasn't just any watch. It was a Patek Philippe with a rose gold casing and a brown leather strap. It was a masterpiece of Swiss engineering. It was my watch. I had bought that watch 40 years ago to celebrate my first big contract. It was the symbol of my rise from poverty. On the back, it was engraved with my initials, LK, and the date of my wedding to Odessa. 5 years ago, when I fell ill and disappeared into the hospital system, Brad had raided my personal safe. He had taken the watch. He had sold it to a fence in the city for a fraction of its value to pay off a gambling debt. He thought it was gone forever. He thought he had melted down my legacy to pay for a night at the poker table. And yet here it was. Ticking. Tick. 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 The sound seemed to amplify in the quiet kitchen. Brad picked it up. He turned it over. He saw the engraving. He rubbed his thumb over the letters LK. "No," he whispered. "No. This isn't possible. I sold this. I saw the guy take it. I saw the money." He dropped the watch back into the box as if it burned him. Under the watch was a small folded piece of cardstock, a note. He unfolded it with shaking fingers. I knew exactly what it said because I had written it myself, using my left hand to alter the penmanship just enough to look jagged and unnatural. "I am waiting for you in hell. Come down quick." Lucius King. Brad backed away from the counter. He bumped into the bar stool and almost fell. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the floor. He looked at me. "Did you open this?" he screamed. "Did you see what was in here?" "No, sir," I said, keeping my face blank. "Is it bad news, sir?" "It's him," Brad gibbered. He grabbed his hair with his good hand. "It's the old man. He's not dead. He can't be dead. He wants me. He wants to drag me down." He grabbed the watch and the note and ran out of the kitchen. He didn't go to Tiana. He didn't go to the police. He knew the police wouldn't help him. They already thought he was crazy. If he walked into a precinct showing them a watch from a dead man, they would lock him up in a padded room. He needed proof. He needed someone who would believe him. Half an hour later, I heard him on the phone in his study. He was shouting, "I don't care how much it costs. I need a private investigator. The best you have. I need you to find out if a man is really dead. Yes, I am serious. His name is Lucius King." I smiled as I watered the ferns in the hallway. He was calling the number I had left on his desk 2 days ago, a flyer for a discreet investigation firm. The man on the other end of the line was not a stranger. He was an old associate of mine, a former detective named Miller who had been forced off the force for being too good at digging up dirt on the wrong people. Miller was on my payroll now. I heard Brad agree to a meeting. Tonight, at the cemetery. The trap was set. Night fell with a vengeance. The rain had returned, turning the world into a blur of wet asphalt and mud. Brad left the house at 10 o'clock. He drove the rental car because his Porsche was still impounded. He drove badly, swerving over the center line, his mind clouded by terror and pain medication. I followed him, not in a car, but in the van with the Alpha team. We kept our distance, watching his tracker move across the map. He arrived at the cemetery gates. It was an old graveyard filled with weeping willows and mossy headstones. The perfect setting for a ghost story. Miller was waiting for him by the gate, leaning against a black sedan, smoking a cigarette. He looked the part. Trench coat, fedora, a face that had seen too much. Brad stumbled out of the car. He was holding a flashlight in his good hand, the beam cutting through the rain. "Did you find it?" Brad shouted over the wind. "Did you find the records?" Miller threw his cigarette into a puddle. "Better," Miller growled. "I found the grave." Brad froze. "Is he in it? Is the old bastard really down there?" Miller shook his head slowly. "I don't know. The soil looked loose, fresh, like someone had been digging recently. I think you need to see for yourself." "No," Brad whimpered. I can't look." "You paid me to find the truth," Miller said. "The truth is 6 feet down. If you want to know if he sent that watch, you have to look in the box." He handed Brad a shovel. Brad stared at it. He had a broken arm. He was exhausted. But the paranoia was stronger than the pain. He needed to know. He needed to prove that Lucius King was rotting bones so he could sleep again. He took the shovel. They walked to the family plot. It was in the back corner under a massive oak tree. The headstone was simple gray granite. Lucius King, beloved husband and father. Brad looked at the ground. Miller was right. The grass was disturbed. The earth was a mound of wet clay. Brad began to dig. It was pathetic to watch. He dug with one hand, using his hip to drive the shovel into the mud. He was crying. He was cursing. He was slipping in the muck, ruining his Italian shoes and his designer pants. "Why won't you stay dead?" he screamed at the dirt. "Why are you doing this to me?" I watched from the darkness of the trees using my night vision binoculars. It took him an hour of labor in the freezing rain, an hour of breaking his body to uncover his own nightmare. Clunk. The shovel hit wood. Brad dropped the shovel. He fell to his knees in the hole, clawing at the mud with his bare hands. He cleared the top of the casket. It was a high-quality mahogany box, the one Tiana had picked out. "Open it," Miller said from the edge of the grave. His voice was cold, merciless. Brad reached for the latch. His cast was covered in mud. His fingers were bleeding. He popped the latches. 1, 2, he took a deep breath. He lifted the heavy lid. He shone the flashlight into the coffin. A scream tore out of his throat. A sound so raw and terrified it silenced the crickets. The coffin was empty. No bones, no dust, no suit. Just a pristine white satin pillow. And pinned to the pillow was another note. Brad leaned in, shaking violently to read it. "I told you I was waiting. You are digging in the wrong place. Look behind you." Brad spun around in the grave. He looked up at the edge of the hole. Lightning flashed, illuminating the silhouette of a man standing next to Miller. A man in a dark suit. A man holding a black umbrella. It was me. I stood there for 1 second, just long enough for the lightning to show him my face, the face he thought was dead, the face he had just spent an hour digging for. Brad scrambled backward, crab-walking against the mud wall of the grave. "Lucius," he shrieked. "Ghost! Demon! Help me! Miller, help me!" Miller looked down at him. He didn't offer a hand. he just shrugged. "I don't see anyone," Mr. Sterling Miller said. "You're talking to the air again." Brad looked back at me, but I was gone. I had stepped back behind the oak tree, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as I had appeared. But he had seen me. He knew. He was trapped in a hole in the ground, staring at an empty coffin while his hired help told him he was hallucinating. His mind finally snapped. The tether that held him to reality, the belief that the world followed logical rules, broke. He curled up in the bottom of the muddy, empty grave and began to laugh. It was a wet, bubbling laugh. "He's everywhere," Brad giggled. "He's the gardener. He's the ghost. He's the dirt. He's the watch." Miller turned and walked away, leaving him there in the rain. I waited until Miller was clear. Then I walked to the edge of the grave one last time. I didn't let him see me. I just spoke, my voice carried by the wind. "Cover it back up, Brad. You made this mess. You clean it up." I heard him sobbing as he picked up the shovel. He obeyed. He was broken. He was no longer a man. He was a puppet, and I held all the strings. I walked back to the van. The Alpha team was silent. Even they were unsettled by the brutality of the psychological dismantling. "Is it done?" the kid asked quietly. "Not yet," I said, wiping the rain from my face. "He knows I'm back, but he doesn't know why. He thinks I'm a ghost haunting him. Tomorrow I'm going to show him that a living man is much more dangerous than a dead one. Tomorrow we take the company. Tomorrow we strip the final layer of his armor." I looked back at the cemetery. A lone flashlight beam was bobbing up and down in the darkness as a broken man tried to bury an empty box. "Sleep tight, son," I whispered. "The nightmare is only just beginning." The gavel hit the podium with the sound of a pistol shot. "Sold, to the gentleman in the gray suit." The auction was in full swing. Brad Sterling was liquidating my life, one piece at a time. The grand ballroom of the estate had been transformed into a marketplace for vultures. He had invited the city's elite, not because they were his friends, but because they had money and they smelled blood. Everyone knew Brad was in trouble. The rumors of the police raid and the SEC investigation had circulated through the country clubs like a virus. But rich people love a fire sale. They love to pick through the bones of a fallen empire if it means getting a discount on a Louis XIV chair. I stood in the back of the room wearing my waiter's uniform. I held a tray of champagne, but my eyes were fixed on the stage. Brad was up there standing next to the auctioneer. He looked manic. His broken right arm was in a sling, but his left hand was gripping the microphone so hard his knuckles were white. He was sweating under the hot stage lights. He was trying to charm the crowd, cracking jokes that fell flat, laughing too loudly at things that weren't funny. He was desperate. The $7 million from the house sale was frozen because of the flagged serial numbers. He needed liquid cash tonight. He needed to pay the mob loan by midnight or they would come for his other leg. He was selling everything. The silver tea set Odessa had received from her grandmother, the Persian rugs, the crystal chandelier. I watched as a woman in a fur coat bought my favorite reading chair for a fraction of its value. It hurt to see these things go. Each object held a memory, a story, but I let them go. Objects can be replaced, dignity cannot. And tonight I was buying back my family's dignity with the currency of Brad's humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brad announced, his voice cracking slightly, "we have saved the best for last, the crown jewel of the King estate." He gestured to a large easel covered by a heavy red velvet cloth. It stood in the center of the stage, bathed in a spotlight. Two assistants moved to the easel. "This is an original oil painting from the 17th century, Brad said, his eyes gleaming with greed. "It has been in the family for 3 generations, appraised at $200,000, but tonight we are starting the bidding at 50. Do I hear 50,000? The crowd murmured. This was what they had waited for. The sharks began to circle. Paddles were raised. 50,000, 55, 60. Brad was beaming. He was doing the math in his head. 60,000 would buy him another week of life. It would buy him a plane ticket to a non-extradition country. He looked at Tiana, who was sitting in the front row. She was dressed in black, looking like a grieving widow. He winked at her, a cruel, arrogant wink that said, "I am still winning." I caught Tiana's eye. She didn't wink back. She just touched the wooden doll in her pocket and looked down. Going once, the auctioneer shouted. Going twice. 70,000, a voice called out from the back. It was Victor Plant. He was driving the price up, making Brad believe salvation was within reach. Sold to the man in the back for $70,000, Brad shouted, snatching the gavel from the auctioneer. He was so excited he wanted to bang it himself. "Let's see the masterpiece," the auctioneer said, reaching for the velvet cloth. Brad stepped forward. "I want to unveil it myself," he said. He grabbed the corner of the red fabric with his good hand. The room went silent. The anticipation was palpable. I signaled the tech crew in the booth. The house lights dimmed, leaving only the harsh spotlight on the easel. Brad pulled the cloth. "Voila!" he shouted, throwing his arm out in a grand gesture. The cloth fluttered to the floor. For a second there was silence. Absolute, total silence. Then came a gasp. It started in the front row and rippled back like a wave. Then came the whispers, sharp, shocked whispers that sounded like hissing snakes. Brad was smiling at the audience, waiting for the applause. He didn't look at the painting. He was looking at the faces of the buyers. He saw their confusion. He saw their disgust. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. A man stood up and put on his glasses, squinting at the stage. "What is that?" someone shouted. Brad frowned. "What do you mean, what is that?" "It's a masterpiece." He turned around. He looked at the easel. It wasn't the 17th century landscape of rolling hills and cherubs. That painting was safely hidden in the trunk of my car. Replacing it was a high-resolution enlargement of a photograph. It was grainy and green-tinted, taken with a night vision lens. But the image was crystal clear. It showed a bedroom. It showed an elderly woman cowering in a chair. And standing over her was a man with a distinct profile, a man holding a syringe in a threatening manner, preparing to inject the terrified woman. It was the image from 2 nights ago, Brad attacking Odessa. The image was so large that you could see the sweat on Brad's forehead. You could see the fear in Odessa's eyes. You could see the label on the syringe. Brad froze. His brain couldn't process what he was seeing. He blinked rapidly, thinking it was another hallucination, thinking the drugs were playing tricks on him again. He reached out and touched the canvas. It was real. It wasn't a projection. It was a physical print mounted on the board. "No," he whispered. The crowd began to turn on him. These were people who tolerated greed. They tolerated tax evasion. But elder abuse, assaulting a helpless grandmother with a needle, that was a bridge too far even for them. "Is that you, Mr. Sterling?" a reporter from the local paper shouted from the side. He snapped a photo. "Flash!" Brad spun around, blinded by the camera flash. "No," he screamed. "This is fake. This is a lie." He grabbed the easel, trying to knock it over. But I had weighted the base. It stood firm, a monument to his cruelty. "It's Photoshop," Brad yelled, his voice rising to a hysterical shriek. "It's AI. Someone hacked the feed. It's not real. I never did that." He looked at Tiana. "Tell them, Tiana. Tell them it's fake." Tiana stood up slowly. All eyes turned to her. She looked at the photo. Then she looked at Brad. She didn't speak. She just started to cry. A soft, heartbroken sobbing that was more damning than any accusation. She turned and ran out of the room. Her silence convicted him. The crowd erupted. People were standing up, knocking over chairs. They were booing. Some were calling the police. Brad was alone on the stage. He looked small. He looked broken. The photo loomed over him, a giant green judgment. He attacked the photo again. He clawed at it with his fingernails, trying to rip the face of the attacker, trying to erase himself. He ripped a strip of the paper off, but underneath was just more backing board. He turned to the crowd, waving the scrap of paper. "Listen to me," he pleaded. "I am being set up. There is a conspiracy. The gardener. It's the gardener. He's doing this. He's a ghost." He pointed a shaking finger at the back of the room. "He's there. The old man. He did this." Everyone turned to look. I was standing there, holding my tray. I looked terrified. I looked like a confused old servant, wondering why the master was screaming at him. I shook my head slightly, looking at the guests nearby. I tapped my temple with a sad expression, implying that the master had finally lost his mind completely. The guests nodded in understanding. "Poor Mr. Sterling. He's had a psychotic break. The drugs, the stress. He's hallucinating. Security, call security," someone yelled. 2 large guards moved toward the stage. Brad saw them coming. He panicked. He thought they were the mob. He thought they were the Reapers. He jumped off the stage. He landed badly, jarring his broken arm. He screamed in pain but kept running. He knocked over a table of antique vases. Crash. Thousands of dollars of porcelain shattered on the floor. He ran toward the exit, pushing past women in evening gowns. "Get out of my way," he shouted. "I have to get out. The house is alive." He burst through the double doors and ran into the stormy night. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. The tracker was on his car, the police were on their way, and the mob was watching. I walked calmly to the stage. The room was in chaos, but I moved with purpose. I set my tray down on the auctioneer's podium. I walked over to the easel. I picked up the velvet cloth from the floor. I covered the photo. "The show is over, folks," I said to the nearest guest. My voice was calm, authoritative. "Please make your way to the exits. The police will want statements." I looked at the covered easel. It wasn't just a photo. It was a mirror. Brad had finally looked into it, and he couldn't survive what he saw. I walked backstage. Tiana was waiting there. She had stopped crying. She was wiping her face with a tissue. "Did it work?" she asked. I nodded. "He's running. He has no money, no reputation, and the whole city just saw him for what he is." "What now?" she asked. "Now we let him run," I said. "A rat will always run to its hole, and we know exactly where that hole is." I took off my waiter's jacket. Underneath, I was wearing a tactical vest. "Go to your mother," I said. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but me." I walked out the back door into the rain. The wind felt good. It felt like a cleansing. Brad was heading for the marina. I knew it. He had a small boat there. He thought he could sail away, but the storm was raging, the waves were high, and the engine of that boat had a fuel line that was about to experience a very unfortunate malfunction. I got into my van. The Alpha team was already tracking him. "Target is moving east," the kid said over the comms. "High speed. Reckless driving." "Let him go," I said. "Let him feel the fear." I started the engine. Tonight, the debt gets paid in full. The chaos in the ballroom had reached a fever pitch. It was a symphony of destruction, and I was the conductor. Brad Sterling was scrambling toward the exit, pushing past the confused socialites who were still clutching their champagne glasses. He looked like a rat on a sinking ship, desperate to find a hole to crawl into. He had knocked over the vases. He had screamed at the guests. He had exposed his own darkness to the world, and now he was trying to outrun the consequences. But there is no outrunning the truth. I stood by the service door, my hand resting on the master control panel for the house's electrical system. I watched him run. He was 10 feet from the double doors. He thought he was going to make it. He thought he could disappear into the stormy night, get on his boat, and vanish. Not tonight. I flipped the switch. Instantly, the ballroom was plunged into absolute darkness. The chandeliers died. The sconces faded. The emergency exit signs were disabled. The only light came from the lightning flashing outside, casting strobe like shadows through the high windows. The room erupted in screams. The wealthy guests panicked, huddled together in the dark. Brad froze. I could hear his breathing, ragged and terrified. He was standing in the middle of the floor, disoriented, spinning around in the blackness. "Who did that?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Turn the lights back on. Let me out." I didn't answer. I let him stew in the dark for 10 seconds. 10 seconds of pure silence where the only sound was the pounding of rain against the glass. Then I pressed the second button. A single beam of light cut through the darkness. It was a theatrical spotlight positioned high in the rafters. It didn't aim at the stage. It didn't aim at the exit. It aimed directly at the top of the grand staircase. The beam was blindingly white, a pillar of purity in the gloom. And stepping into that light was not the hunched figure of the old gardener. It was not the servant in the waiter's uniform. It was Lucius King. I had shed the disguise. The gray work clothes were gone. The fake beard was gone. I was wearing my old dress uniform, a black military cut suit tailored to perfection. On my chest gleamed a row of medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star. Medals I had earned in a life Brad knew nothing about. Medals that proved I knew how to fight wars that were far more dangerous than his petty corporate games. But I wasn't alone. Beside me, holding my arm, was Odessa. Tiana and I had prepared her during the chaos. She was no longer wearing the rags Brad had forced her into. She was draped in a gown of midnight blue silk. Her silver hair was brushed and pinned up. She stood tall, her dementia momentarily cleared by the adrenaline of the moment. She looked like exactly what she was, the queen of this estate. We stood there at the top of the stairs, looking down at the darkness, looking down at him. The room fell silent. The guests stared up at us, awestruck by the image, the resurrection. I began to descend. Step, step, step. My polished dress shoes hit the marble stairs with a heavy rhythmic thud. It was the sound of judgment approaching. Brad was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was bathed in the spillover light from the spot. He looked up. His eyes bulged. His jaw hung open. He dropped the briefcase he had been clutching. It hit the floor and popped open, spilling useless papers everywhere. He raised a shaking hand, pointing at me. "You," he wheezed. I kept walking. I didn't rush. Kings do not rush. You're dead," Brad stammered. "I saw the obituary. I saw the grave." "You died 5 years ago." He backed away, tripping over his own feet. He looked at the guests as if pleading for someone to confirm his sanity. Tell him he screamed. Tell him he's dead. He's a ghost. I stopped 3 steps from the bottom. I towered over him. The light caught the gold of my medals. I looked down at this man who had tormented my wife, who had manipulated my daughter, who had tried to erase my existence. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. My voice was deep, resonant, and cold as the grave he thought I was in. "I didn't die, Brad." The words echoed through the silent ballroom. I stepped down to the floor. I walked right up to him. He could smell the sandalwood of my cologne. He could see the life in my eyes. "I was just on a business trip," I said, my voice dripping with irony. "A very long business trip. I had to go away to see who would remain loyal when the king was gone." Brad was shaking so violently his teeth chattered. "But the death certificate, the funeral." I leaned in close. "Paperwork is easy to forge, Brad, especially when you have friends in intelligence. But loyalty is hard to fake, and you failed the test." I looked around the room at the shocked guests. "I apologize for the interruption. Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice booming. "I am Lucius King. This is my house, and this man is a trespasser." Brad looked around. He saw the realization dawning on the faces of the crowd. They weren't looking at a ghost. They were looking at a legend who had returned. "No," Brad whimpered. "This isn't fair. I won. I beat you." I looked him dead in the eye. "You didn't beat anything. You played a game you didn't understand. You thought you were the predator because you were willing to hurt the weak. But you forgot one thing." What is that?" Brad whispered, tears streaming down his face. I straightened my cuffs. I looked at the debris on the floor, the shattered vases, the spilled champagne, the ruin of my beautiful home. I looked back at him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You forgot that the gardener always returns to tend his garden." I signaled toward the main doors. "And I'm back just in time to take out the trash." That was the cue. The main doors burst open. But it wasn't the guests leaving, it was the police. And behind them, the Alpha Team agents in their windbreakers. Brad spun around. He was surrounded. The house he had tried to steal was now his prison. The man he had tried to kill was his judge, and the law was his executioner. He looked at me one last time. There was no arrogance left, no smugness, just the terrified look of a child who realizes the monsters are real. I raised my hand and pointed at him. A simple gesture. "Get him off my floor." The officers moved in. They didn't treat him gently. They grabbed his good arm and twisted it behind his back. They cuffed him while he screamed about conspiracies and ghosts. I turned to Odessa. She was smiling. She rested her head on my shoulder. "Is the trash gone, Lucius?" she asked softly. I kissed her forehead. "Yes, my love. The trash is gone." The lights flickered back on. The nightmare was over. The king had returned. And as they dragged Brad Sterling out into the rain, I knew that this time he wouldn't be coming back. The flashing lights of the local police cruisers were bright, painting the wet driveway in chaotic strokes of red and blue, but they were nothing compared to what came next. Brad Sterling was shouting at the officers, demanding his phone, demanding his lawyer, screaming that he was the victim of a conspiracy. He still thought this was a domestic dispute. He still thought this was a white-collar crime that could be solved with bail money and a good plea deal. He didn't understand the scope of the game board he was standing on. I stood on the porch under the shelter of the overhang, watching the local sergeant try to wrestle Brad into the back of the sedan. The rain was falling harder now, washing away the mud from the grave Brad had dug earlier, washing away the tire tracks of the guests who had fled. Suddenly the air shifted. A low rumble vibrated through the ground. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of heavy engines. 3 black SUVs tore up the driveway, moving with a precision that the local police lacked. They didn't have sirens wailing. They had low-frequency strobe lights mounted in the grills, red and blue. Brad stopped screaming. He looked at the vehicles. Even through his haze of drugs and panic, he recognized the silhouette of federal authority. The SUVs screeched to a halt, blocking the exit. Doors flew open. Men in tactical windbreakers with yellow letters on the back swarmed out. FBI. The local sergeant stepped back, confused. He looked at me, then at the federal agents. "Who are these guys?" he asked. I stepped forward. My military dress uniform was immaculate, my medals catching the strobe lights. "They are the cleanup crew, Sergeant," I said calmly. A tall man with silver hair and a face carved from granite walked toward us. He flashed a badge that carried the weight of the Department of Justice. "Special Agent Graves," he announced. "We are taking custody of the prisoner." Brad's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. "Federal," he stammered. "Is this about the taxes? I can pay the taxes. I can make a deal. I have information." Agent Graves didn't smile. He didn't blink. He walked up to Brad and looked at him with the kind of disgust usually reserved for traitors. "This isn't about taxes," Mr. Sterling Graves said. "You are under arrest for violation of the Economic Espionage Act of 1996 and the unauthorized sale of classified federal property." Brad's mouth fell open. "What? What are you talking about?" "I sold a house. I sold my house. I walked down the steps. I stood next to Agent Graves." "I think you should explain it to him," Lucius Graves said, nodding at me. "He looks confused." I looked at Brad. I pitied him in that moment. He was a small man trying to swim in an ocean full of leviathans. "You didn't sell your house, Brad," I said, my voice cutting through the rain. "You sold this house. And do you know who really owns this estate?" Brad shook his head dumbly. "The deed, it was in Odessa's name. On paper I corrected him. A cover, a shell. But looking deeper into the title history, the land this house sits on was purchased 30 years ago by a holding company called Sentinel Trust." I pulled a document from my inside pocket. It was stamped with red ink. "Top secret. Sentinel Trust is a front for the Defense Intelligence Agency," I explained. "This estate is designated as a Level 4 safe house. It is a federal asset used for debriefing assets and securing sensitive data. It is not a private residence. It is a government facility." Brad looked at the house, then back at me. You're a spook." "I was a contractor," I said. "A specialist. And when you forced Odessa to sign that deed over to Victor, you weren't just committing real estate fraud. You were transferring ownership of a secure federal facility to a foreign national." "Victor," Brad whispered. "The Russian buyer." I nodded. "Victor is one of my men, yes. But on paper, and according to the digital trail my team created for you, Victor is an operative for a foreign intelligence service." Brad's knees gave out. The officers had to hold him up. "You signed the papers, Brad," I continued relentlessly. "We have your signature selling a CIA safe house to a Russian operative for $7 million in cash. That is treason. That is a threat to national security." "But I didn't know," Brad wailed. "I didn't know." "Ignorance of the law is not a defense," Graves interjected, "especially when we found the other files." "Other files?" Brad gasped. I smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. "My Alpha team didn't just lock your accounts, Brad. We planted a little something on your private server. The server you tried to wipe this morning." I gestured to the house. "When the forensics team goes through your hard drives, they are going to find terabytes of encrypted schematics, defense contract bids, satellite positioning data, all of it stolen, all of it ready for export." Brad started to hyperventilate. "No, that's a lie. You planted it. You framed me." I stepped closer until I was inches from his face. "Who is going to believe you?" I whispered. "You are a drug addict found screaming at ghosts in the dark. You are a man who assaulted his elderly mother-in-law. You are a man who tried to flee the country with a bag of cash. You fit the profile of a desperate, desperate traitor perfectly." Brad looked at Tiana. She was standing on the porch holding her mother's hand. She wasn't looking at him with fear anymore. She was looking at him with pity. "Tiana," he screamed. Tell them your father is crazy. Tell them he did this." Tiana didn't move. She didn't speak. She just turned her back on him and walked Odessa inside the house. The rejection was final. Agent Graves signaled his men. "Get him out of here. He's going to a black site for debriefing before arraignment. No bail, no phone calls." They dragged him toward the SUV. Brad wasn't screaming anymore. He was weeping. He was broken. He realized that this wasn't a prison sentence. This was an erasure. He was going to a hole in the ground where the sun never shines and lawyers never visit. "Lucius," he sobbed as they shoved him into the vehicle. "You're the devil. You're the devil." I watched the door slam shut. "I am a father, Brad," I said to the closed window. "And that is much worse." The convoy of SUVs turned around. The red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement one last time before disappearing down the long driveway. The local police dispersed, confused but happy to have the paperwork taken off their hands. I stood alone in the driveway. The rain soaked my uniform, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt lighter. The weight of 5 years of silence was gone. The debt was paid. I turned and walked back up the stairs. My house, my fortress. I walked into the foyer. It was quiet. The broken glass had been swept into a pile. The lights were warm. Tiana was in the kitchen making tea. Her hands were steady. "Is he gone?" she asked without turning around. I took off my wet jacket and draped it over a chair. "He is gone," I said. "He won't be coming back. The charges carry a mandatory life sentence, and with the evidence we provided, the trial will be closed to the public. He will simply cease to exist." Tiana turned and looked at me. There were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of relief. "You really are a spy, aren't you?" she asked, half joking, half terrified. I chuckled, a sound that felt rusty in my throat. "I was a lot of things, Tiana. A soldier, an analyst, a businessman. But for the last 5 years, I was just a gardener. And honestly, that was the hardest job of all." "Why?" she asked, handing me a cup of tea. "Because I had to watch the weeds grow and do nothing," I said, taking the cup. "I had to wait until the roots were deep enough to pull the whole thing out." I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark grounds. The storm was passing. The moon was trying to break through the clouds. "The house is safe," I said. "The money is safe. I transferred the funds from the shell company back to the main trust 5 minutes ago. Your inheritance is secure." Tiana hugged me. It was a fierce, desperate hug. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. I patted her hair. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "We still have work to do." "What work?" she asked, pulling back. I pointed to the living room where the furniture was overturned and the walls were scarred from Brad's rampage. "We have to remodel," I said, smiling. "I never liked that wallpaper anyway." We laughed. It was the first time laughter had echoed in this house in years. It sounded like music. But deep down, I knew the truth. The tribunal was over. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence had been carried out. I took a sip of tea. Justice, I thought, is a dish best served cold, but it tastes surprisingly sweet. The rain had turned the driveway into a river of black asphalt, reflecting the chaotic dance of red and blue emergency lights. It felt like the sky was weeping for the years we had lost, or perhaps it was washing the estate clean of the filth that had accumulated under the roof. Brad Sterling was no longer the master of the house. He was no longer the arrogant tyrant who drank my scotch and kicked my dog. He was a prisoner. 2 federal agents gripped his arms. They didn't hold him with the respect due to a citizen. They held him with the firm, indifferent grip used for cargo that needs to be transported to a disposal facility. Brad was stumbling, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the wet pavement. His hair was plastered to his skull and his eyes were wild, darting back and forth between the agents and the house he had tried to steal. "Tiana, help me!" he screamed. His voice was raw, tearing through the sound of the rain. "Don't let them take me. They are going to put me in a hole, Tiana. You can't let them do this. I'm your husband. I'm the love of your life." I stood on the bottom step of the porch under the shelter of the overhang. My military dress uniform was dry. My medals caught the strobe lights flashing gold and silver in the gloom. Beside me stood Tiana. She was holding Odessa's hand, but her eyes were locked on Brad. She didn't look like a victim anymore. The trembling girl who used to hide in the solarium was gone. In her place was a woman forged in fire. She stood with her back straight, her chin high, looking down at the man who had spent 5 years convincing her she was nothing. Brad saw her watching. He tried to lunge toward her, but the agents jerked him back. "Baby, please," he sobbed, changing his tactic from anger to pathetic begging. "I did it for us. I sold the house for us. I wanted to buy us a yacht. I wanted to take you to the Mediterranean. Everything I did was for you. Tell them I'm a good man." Tiana stepped out from the overhang. She walked into the rain. The water soaked her dress instantly, but she didn't flinch. She walked until she was 3 feet away from him. Brad stopped struggling. He looked at her with a glimmer of hope. He thought his manipulation was working. He thought he could still pluck the strings of her heart. "Tiana," he whispered. "Thank God. Tell them to unhand me." Tiana raised her left hand. The diamond ring on her finger glittered in the harsh light of the FBI floodlights. It was a massive stone, a symbol of his wealth, a symbol of his supposed love. She looked at the ring. Then she looked at him. "You know, Brad," she said, her voice cutting through the storm. "For years I looked at this ring and I felt heavy. I felt like it was a shackle. You told me it cost $50,000. You told me it was flawless, just like our love was supposed to be." Brad nodded frantically. "It is, baby. It's the best. Top clarity." Tiana laughed. It was a cold sound devoid of humor. "I had it appraised yesterday," she said. "I took it to a jeweler while you were busy trying to sell my mother's home. Do you know what he told me?" Brad froze. His eyes shifted away. "He told me it's cubic zirconia," Tiana said. "It's glass, Brad. It's worth maybe $200. You swapped out the real diamond years ago, didn't you? You probably sold the real one to pay off a gambling debt or to buy one of your mistresses a gift." She began to twist the ring off her finger. "You let me walk around wearing glass while you pretended to be a king," she said. "You let me believe I was worth something to you when all I was to you was a signature on a check and a body in your bed." She pulled the ring free. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger. "Brad, please," she said, mocking his tone. "It wasn't for us. It was always for you." She threw the ring. It didn't arc gracefully. It was a hard, fast throw. The metal band hit Brad squarely in the center of his forehead. It bounced off, leaving a small red mark, and clattered onto the wet driveway. "It's fake," she whispered. "Just like your personality. Just like your love. Just like your life." Brad stared at the ring lying in a puddle. The facade was gone. He had been stripped of his wealth, his freedom, and now his last shred of personal dignity. I walked down the steps. The sound of my boots on the pavement was heavy and deliberate. I moved past Tiana. I signaled the agents to wait. "I need a moment with the prisoner," I said. The agents nodded. They respected the uniform. They respected the man who had handed them a traitor on a silver platter. I walked up to Brad. He looked small. He was shivering violently. He looked up at me with terror. He knew who I was now. He knew I wasn't the gardener. He knew I wasn't a ghost. I was the architect of his destruction. "Lucius," he whimpered, "please, I'll sign anything. I'll confess to the fraud. Just don't let them take me to the black site. I can't do federal prison. I'm not built for that." I leaned in close. I wanted him to feel my breath on his ear. I wanted my voice to be the last thing he remembered before the cell door slammed shut. "You should have thought about that before you raised your hand against my wife," I whispered. I reached out and patted his cheek. It was a mocking gesture, a parody of affection. "You like hitting old people, don't you, Brad? You like feeling powerful when you strike someone who can't fight back. You like hearing them cry." Brad shook his head, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "No. It was an accident. I didn't mean it." I gripped his jaw, forcing him to look me in the eye. "There are no accidents, Brad, only consequences, and you are about to face a lifetime of them." I smiled. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a trapped rabbit. "Let me tell you a secret about where you are going. Federal prison is a hard place. It's filled with men who have done terrible things. But even they have a code. They don't like men who hurt women. They don't like men who abuse the elderly." I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a rasp that sounded like gravel grinding on bone. "You were the big man in this house. You were the king. But inside those walls, you are going to be the smallest thing there is. You are going to be the one who can't fight back." I paused, letting the words sink in. "In there, you won't be Mr. Sterling. In there, you're going to be the Nana." Brad's eyes widened in horror. He understood. He understood exactly what I was saying. I was telling him that the cycle of abuse was about to turn and he was going to be on the receiving end. "Have fun, Brad," I whispered. "I hear the nights are very long." I pulled back and nodded to the agents. "Take him away." "No," Brad screamed. "No. Lucius, wait. Tiana, wait." The agents didn't wait. They shoved him into the back of the SUV. He hit the seat hard. The door slammed shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. I watched him through the tinted glass. He was pressing his face against the window, pounding on it, screaming words we couldn't hear. He looked like a ghost trapped in a bottle. The convoy began to move. The SUVs rolled down the driveway, tires splashing through the puddles. We watched them go. We watched the red tail lights fade into the distance until they were swallowed by the night and the rain. Silence returned to the estate. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the gentle rhythm of the rain, which was already beginning to lighten. The storm was passing. Tiana was still standing in the driveway, staring at the empty road. She was shivering now, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving her cold and wet. I walked over to her. I took off my dress jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy with metals and gold braid. It weighed a ton, but it was a good weight, the weight of protection. "It's over," I said softly. She looked up at me. Her makeup was running, her hair was a mess, but she had never looked more beautiful. She looked like a survivor. "Is he really gone?" she asked. I nodded. "He has gone to a place where money doesn't matter and lies don't work. He is gone forever." She looked down at the puddle where the fake ring lay. She kicked it with her bare foot, sending it skittering into the drainage ditch. "Good riddance," she whispered. I put my arm around her. "Come on, let's get inside. Mama is waiting." We walked back up the stairs. Odessa was waiting in the doorway, holding the door open. She looked at us. She looked at the empty driveway. "Did the trash truck come?" she asked innocently. I laughed. It was a deep belly laugh that released 5 years of tension. "Yes, Odessa. The trash truck came, and they took everything." We walked inside. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. The sound of the lock clicking into place wasn't ominous anymore. It was the sound of safety. I looked around the foyer. It was a mess. There was mud on the floor. There were shattered vases. There were holes in the wall. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like a home. I looked at my hands. They were calloused and stained from years of gardening. I had spent so much time pretending to be a servant that I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be a master. But looking at my daughter and my wife safe and smiling, I realized something. I wasn't the master because I owned the house. I was the master because I had defended it. I walked to the fireplace and lit a match. I threw it onto the logs. The fire caught instantly, bathing the room in a warm golden glow. Tomorrow I would hire contractors. Tomorrow I would call my bankers. Tomorrow we would start rebuilding. But tonight we would rest. I sat down in the only chair that hadn't been sold or broken. I closed my eyes and listened to the fire crackle. The gardener had finished his work. The weeds were pulled. The pests were gone. Now it was time to watch the flowers bloom. The last of the blue and red lights faded from the living room walls, leaving us in the warm glow of the fireplace. The storm outside was retreating its fury, spent much like the man who had just been dragged away in handcuffs. The silence that filled the estate was heavy, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a battlefield after the last cannon has fired. It was the silence of a clean slate. I stood by the window watching the taillights of the federal convoy disappear into the night. My military jacket felt heavy on my shoulders, but for the first time in 5 years, my heart felt light. I turned back to the room. The wreckage of the evening was all around us, shattered porcelain, overturned chairs, and mud on the expensive carpets. But amidst the debris, the two most important things in my world were safe. Tiana was standing in the center of the room. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance on the driveway had evaporated, leaving her trembling and small. She looked around at the broken house, at the signs of the violence she had lived with for so long. The reality of what she had done and what she had allowed to happen seemed to crash down on her all at once. She looked at me. I wasn't the gardener anymore. I was her father. I was the man she thought she had buried, the man she had mourned, and the man she had ultimately betrayed by signing away his legacy to a monster. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her legs simply gave out. She collapsed to her knees on the hard floor, covering her face with her hands. A sob tore through her, a sound so raw and filled with anguish that it echoed off the high ceilings. "Daddy," she choked out. I'm so sorry, I didn't know, I was so scared." I walked over to her. The sound of my boots on the floor was the only other noise in the room. I stood over her, looking down at the top of her head. I saw the little girl who used to wait for me by the door when I came home from work. I saw the teenager who defied me, and I saw the woman who had lost her way. I didn't kneel immediately. I let her cry. I let her pour out the poison of the last 5 years. I ruined everything, she sobbed, rocking back and forth. I let him take over. I let him hurt Mama. I let him sell the house. I was weak. I was so stupid. I deserved to go to jail with him. I waited until the storm of her tears began to subside. Then I slowly lowered myself to one knee. My old joints protested, but I ignored the pain. I reached out and took her hands, pulling them away from her face. "Look at me, Tiana," I said. My voice was firm but gentle. She refused to look up. She was too ashamed. "Look at me," I repeated. Slowly she raised her eyes. They were red and swollen, filled with a guilt that could eat a person alive. "You were wrong," I said. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't lie. "You were wrong because you were weak. You let a wolf into the sheep pen because he had a shiny coat and a smooth tongue. You traded your dignity for a false sense of security. And when he showed his teeth, you didn't fight back. You hid." Tiana flinched at the truth. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know," she whispered. "I know." But I continued my grip on her hands, tightening. That was yesterday. That was the old Tiana. The Tiana who stood on the driveway tonight. The Tiana who threw that ring into the mud. That woman was not weak. That woman was a king. I reached up and wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "You made a mistake, baby girl. A terrible, expensive mistake. But you didn't break. You bent. And tonight you snapped back." I stood up and pulled her with me. She rose to her feet, unsteady but supported by my grip. "You are free now," I said, looking deep into her eyes. "The debt is paid. The monster is in a cage. You have a second chance. Do not waste it on guilt. Guilt is a useless emotion. It changes nothing." I placed my hands on her shoulders. "Live properly, Tiana. That is your penance. Live with your head high. Live with the strength you found tonight. Be the woman I know you are. Be the daughter your mother needs. That is how you say you're sorry. Not with tears, but with a life well lived." She nodded, sniffing back the tears. She took a deep breath. She straightened her spine. "I will, Daddy," she said. "I promise." "Good," I said. "Now go wash your face. You look like a raccoon." She let out a small, watery laugh. She hugged me tightly, burying her face in my chest for a moment before pulling away and heading toward the bathroom. I turned my attention to the other woman in the room. Odessa was sitting on the sofa watching us. She was quiet. Her hands were folded in her lap. The blue silk dress I had put her in was wrinkled, and there was a smudge of soot on her hem, but she looked regal. Throughout the chaos of the night, the gunshots, the screaming, the police, she had been an anchor. Her mind, often lost in the fog of dementia, had its own way of processing trauma. Sometimes I thought she understood everything. Sometimes I thought she understood nothing. I walked over to her. "Are you all right, Odessa?" I asked, offering her my arm. She looked up at me. Her eyes were clear. "I'm thirsty, Lucius," she said simply. I smiled. "Of course. Let's have tea." I led her not to her bedroom but to the dining room. This room had been Brad's domain for too long. He had sat at the head of the table, drinking my wine and shouting orders. Tonight we were reclaiming it. The long mahogany table was dusty. I used the sleeve of my uniform to wipe down the head chair. It was a high-backed chair upholstered in velvet. The throne of the house. "Sit here, my love," I said, pulling the chair out for her. She sat down. She ran her hands over the wooden armrests. She looked small in the big chair, but she filled it with her presence. She belonged there. I went to the kitchen. I didn't rush. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. I found the good china, the set with the gold rim that we hadn't used in years. I found the tin of Earl Grey tea that she loved. While the water boiled, I looked out the kitchen window. The first hint of gray was touching the horizon. Dawn was coming. The longest night of our lives was finally ending. I prepared the tea on a silver tray. I added the sugar cubes just the way she liked them, two for her, none for me. I carried the tray back to the dining room. I placed it on the table. I poured the tea. The amber liquid steamed in the cool morning air. The clink of the silver spoon against the porcelain was a sound of civilization returning to a lawless land. I placed the cup in front of her. "Here you go," I said softly. I pulled up a chair next to her, not at the head of the table, but at her right hand. I sat down and took my own cup. Odessa took a sip. She closed her eyes, savoring the warmth. "It's good," she said. She put the cup down and looked at me. She studied my face. She looked at the gray in my beard. She looked at the lines around my eyes. She looked at the medals on my chest. For months she had looked at me and seen a stranger. She had seen a gardener, a servant, a nice man who fixed things. But tonight the fog had lifted. Perhaps it was the shock. Perhaps it was the sight of her husband in his true form. Or perhaps it was just the grace of God granting us a moment of connection. She reached out and touched my hand. Her skin was paper-thin, warm, and dry. "You have new lines on your face, Lucius," she said softly. I turned my hand over and squeezed hers. "I've had a hard few years, Odessa. I've been working." She nodded slowly. Her eyes searched mine. "I missed you," she whispered. "The house was very cold without you. There was a bad man here. He was very loud." "He's gone now," I promised. "He won't ever be loud in this house again." She smiled. It was the smile of the girl I had married 50 years ago, mischievous and sweet. "Good," she said. I didn't like his shoes. They were cheap. I laughed, a genuine laugh that shook my chest. "You are right, my love. He had terrible taste in shoes." She squeezed my hand tighter. Her expression turned serious. "You went away for a long time, Lucius. I know," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I had to. I had to fix things." She shook her head slightly, a gentle admonishment. "You were gone too long, boy," she said. Her voice was steady. "Don't leave me with the loud people again. I get lonely." The word boy hit me harder than any bullet could have. It was what she used to call me when we were dating when I was just a young soldier shipping out for my first tour. It was a term of endearment that bridged the decades. I slid out of my chair and knelt beside her again. I pressed my forehead against her hand. "I promise, Odessa, I'm not going anywhere. I am retired. The only thing I'm going to fix from now on is this house, and the only person I'm going to serve is you." She patted my cheek. "That's good," she said. "Now drink your tea. It's getting cold." We sat there in the quiet dining room as the sun began to rise. The light crept across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Tiana came downstairs freshly washed, wearing clean clothes. She stood in the doorway watching us. I waved her over. "Come sit, Tiana," I said. "Have some tea." She walked over and sat on Odessa's left. We were a family again, broken, battered, scarred, but together. I looked at the empty chair at the other end of the table, the chair where Brad used to sit. It was just a piece of furniture now. It held no power. I took a sip of my tea. It was strong and bitter, just the way I liked it. The war was over. The enemy was vanquished. I looked at my wife, who was humming a soft tune. I looked at my daughter, who was finally breathing freely. I realized then that I wasn't the king because of the money or the house or the medals. I was the king because I had these two women to protect. And God help anyone who tried to touch them again. I leaned back in my chair and watched the sunrise. "Welcome home, Lucius," I whispered to myself. "Welcome home." The seasons have changed 4 times since the flashing lights took the trash away. The estate looks different now. It is no longer a cold showroom of pretension and fear. It is a home. The hydrangeas I planted last spring have bloomed in riots of blue and purple. The hedges are trimmed but not tortured. The grass is green and soft, meant for running feet, not just for looking at. I sat on the wide wooden porch in my favorite rocking chair. On the small table beside me lay the disassembled pieces of my service pistol. The smell of gun oil and old steel mixed with the scent of the jasmine climbing the trellis. It is a comforting smell. Some people smell lavender to relax. I smell ballistol and brass. It reminds me that peace is not a natural state of the world. Peace is something you build, and then it is something you guard. I picked up the slide and wiped it down with a cotton rag. The metal was cold and heavy. I didn't need to carry it anymore. The threat was gone. Brad Sterling was currently serving the first year of 3 consecutive life sentences in a federal supermax facility in Colorado. He spends 23 hours a day in a concrete box. I heard through my contacts that he tried to be the big man on his cell block. I heard he tried to bully an old inmate. I also heard that he is now washing socks for the entire wing to pay for his protection. Justice has a way of being poetic. I looked up as a car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a flashy sports car. It was a sensible, reliable sedan. Tiana stepped out. She looked tired, but it was a good tired. The kind of tired that comes from building something real, not from carrying the weight of lies. She walked up the steps holding a briefcase. She wasn't wearing the gaudy jewelry Brad used to force on her. She was wearing a simple business suit. She looked like a CEO, because she was one. After the dust settled, Tiana didn't just crawl into a hole. She took the remaining assets, she took the trust fund we recovered, and she started a foundation, the Phoenix Initiative. She helps women and the elderly recover their stolen assets from predatory guardians and abusive partners. She uses her story to save others. She turned her shame into a sword. "Hey, Daddy," she said, kissing my cheek. "Hey, baby girl," I said, putting down the rag. "How was the board meeting?" She smiled and sat on the railing. "Tough, but we got the funding. We are going to open 3 new shelters next month." I nodded, my chest swelling with a pride that had nothing to do with medals. "You did good, Tiana. You did good." She looked at the gun parts on the table. She didn't flinch. A year ago, the sight of a weapon would have made her shake. Now she just nodded. "Cleaning day," she asked. "Maintenance," I corrected. "A tool is only as good as the hand that holds it and the care it receives. You don't wait for the rust to appear, you prevent it." She looked out at the garden. "Is Mama inside?" I pointed toward the solarium. "She is having her music lesson." We both fell silent, listening. Through the open windows came the sound of a piano being played clumsily but enthusiastically. And then came the voices. One voice was thin and shaky but filled with joy. That was Odessa. The other voice was small and high-pitched. That was Leo, Tiana's son, my great-grandson. He had been living with his father across the country, but after everything happened, Tiana fought for custody and won. She brought him home. She brought life back to this mausoleum. I listened to them singing. It was an old gospel song. "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine," they sang together. I closed my eyes. I remembered the night Brad forced Odessa to sing. I remembered the fear in her voice. I remembered how small she looked. Now she sounded like a giant. Her dementia was still there, drifting in and out like the tide. But here in this safe harbor, she was happy. She was useful. She was teaching the next generation. Tiana reached out and covered my hand with hers. "Thank you," she whispered. I opened my eyes. "For what?" "For saving us," she said. "For coming back from the dead." I turned my hand over and squeezed hers. The scar on my hand, the V-shape she used to trace, was faded now, but still there. "I didn't save you, Tiana," I said softly. "I just reminded you of who you were. You saved yourself when you threw that ring away. I just cleared the path." She stood up and smoothed her skirt. "I'm going to go join them." Leo promised to show me his new drawing. "Go on," I said. She walked into the house, leaving the door open. I heard her greet them. I heard Leo shout "Mommy" with pure, unadulterated delight. I heard Odessa laugh. I was alone on the porch again, just me and the gun. I began to reassemble the weapon. Click, slide, snap. My hands moved with muscle memory that went back 50 years. I didn't need to look. I thought about the journey. I thought about the humiliation of playing the fool. The days of biting my tongue while a lesser man insulted my wife. The nights spent sleeping in a shed. It was worth every second. There is a misconception in this modern world that forgiveness is the ultimate virtue. People say you should forgive your enemies to find peace. They say revenge is a poison. Maybe they are right. I didn't feel poisoned. I felt clean. I didn't forgive Brad. I didn't offer him grace. I offered him consequences. There are some sins that cannot be washed away with an apology. There are some people who look at kindness and see weakness. For those people, you don't bring an olive branch. You bring the storm. I slid the magazine into the well. It locked into place with a satisfying crisp sound. I racked the slide, checking the chamber one last time. The garden was beautiful. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. It was a picture of tranquility. But I knew the truth. The world is full of wolves. They are always out there circling the perimeter, waiting for the lights to go out, waiting for the shepherd to fall asleep. They look for the open gate. They look for the unguarded moment. I placed the pistol back in its holster, which was mounted discreetly under the table. I wasn't planning on using it, but I wasn't planning on being a victim either. I picked up my glass of iced tea. The condensation was cold against my fingers. I looked out past the garden, past the gate, right into the lens of the world. I looked at you. The witness to this story, you might be wondering if I'm happy. Yes, I am. But happiness isn't a permanent state, it's a fleeting moment. Satisfaction, however, is solid. And I am satisfied. I leaned forward in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight. My eyes narrowed slightly, the eyes of a man who has seen the bottom of the grave and climbed back out. Take a lesson from an old soldier. Be kind. Be generous. Love your family with everything you have. Build your gardens and sing your songs. But keep your hedges trimmed, and keep your eyes open. And remember this, don't ever mistake the silence of a man for weakness. That might just be the moment he is reloading. I sat back and took a sip of tea. The sun finally dipped below the horizon. The porch light flickered on. It was a good night. Moral of the story. In a world obsessed with loud displays of power, we often forget the silent strength of those who built the foundations we stand on. Dignity isn't something that can be stripped away by a uniform or a title. It is an innate armor forged in the fires of sacrifice. The greatest mistake a predator can make is to assume that a lion has lost its teeth just because it is resting. Respect your elders, not just for their age, but for the battles they fought so you wouldn't have to. Remember, the eyes that have seen the most darkness are often the ones watching over you with the fiercest light. Justice may sleep, but it never dies. If this story moved you or made you think about the silent guardians in your own life, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength. And let me know in the comments who is the Lucius King in your life. Until next time, keep your head up and your powder dry.